Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The hum of the submarine's engines reverberated through the hull, a constant reminder of the unyielding pressure outside. Dr. Lana Hayes sat in the cramped control room, her fingers lightly resting on the console, eyes fixed on the flickering sonar screen. The vast expanse of the Mariana Trench lay beneath them, an endless void that the human mind could barely comprehend. And yet, here they were, on the verge of exploring it. 5 kilometers below the surface came the voice of Elias Carver, the expedition's leader. His tone was authoritative as always. "Keep your eyes sharp. The unknown begins here." Lana nodded, though the words did little to quell the unease settling in her stomach. Carver's confidence was as unshakable as his obsession with the deep, and though she admired his expertise, there were times when his single-minded pursuit of knowledge felt dangerous. "Sonar readings still clear," Lana replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "No sign of any unusual activity yet." "Good," Carver said, his eyes never leaving the viewport. He had his back to her, but she could hear the barely concealed excitement in his voice. "Keep it that way." She didn't need to look at him to know what he was thinking. Dr. Elias Carver was a man who lived for discovery, for the thrill of unveiling the unknown. And there was no greater unknown than the Mariana Trench, the deepest, most uncharted region of Earth's oceans. It was a place few had dared to explore, and fewer still had returned from with their sanity intact. But Carver believed it held the key to unlocking mysteries older than humanity itself. Something beyond the reach of mere science, something primal. As the submersible descended further, the ocean around them grew darker, a liquid graveyard that swallowed all light. The cabin lights flickered, casting an eerie glow on the small group of researchers who sat in the cramped space. Lana glanced over at the other members of the crew. On her left, Jamie, the technician, was hunched over the equipment, her fingers flying over the control panels. Her concentration was absolute, but Lana could see the tremor in her hands. Jamie was just as nervous as she was, even if she hid it behind her cool demeanor. Across the room, Bill, the senior geologist, was peering out the viewport. Bill had been with Carver on several prior expeditions, and unlike Lana, he had long since embraced the idea that there was nothing humanity couldn't understand, if only they pushed hard enough. But the deeper they went, the more uneasy Bill looked. Lana wasn't sure if it was the weight of the pressure or the weight of what lay below, but she caught him staring at the sonar occasionally, his brow furrowing with concern. "Hey, Lana," Bill called, his voice echoing slightly in the tight space. "You still sure we should be doing this?" Lana turned to face him. "It's our job to explore the unknown, Bill." "Yeah, but there's exploring, and then there's tempting fate. This trench, something feels off about it." She didn't answer immediately. Bill wasn't the only one who felt the tension gnawing at the back of their minds. Since they had crossed into the Mariana Trench, there had been an eerie sense of being watched, a feeling she couldn't shake. The ocean was supposed to be vast and different, yet there was something unnatural about this place. The absence of life, the silence. "The sonar's still clean," she said, forcing a calm she didn't entirely feel. "We're fine." Bill gave her a doubtful glance, but didn't press further. He returned to his observations, though Lana noticed his eyes kept darting back to the screen. It wasn't just the abyss they were descending into that unnerved him. There was something about this particular stretch of the trench that set it apart, something more than just its depth. After a few more moments of tense silence, Carver's voice broke through. "We're entering the first anomaly zone. Prepare yourselves." Lana felt a shiver crawl up her spine, though she kept her composure. "What exactly are we looking for, Elias?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of doubts inside her. "Not what, Lana," Carver said, his gaze still locked on the viewport. "Who?" Lana frowned, glancing at the others. "Who?" Carver's lips twisted into a smile, though it wasn't one she found reassuring. "You'll see." Just keep your eyes open." A heavy silence settled over the crew as the submersible's descent slowed. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The water was so thick, so full of unseen weight, that it seemed to stretch time itself. The hum of the engines was the only sound that cut through the suffocating stillness, until a sudden, sharp ping rang through the cabin. The sonar was flashing rapidly. It wasn't just a fluctuation, it was something distinct, deliberate. A pulse, like a heartbeat in the dark. Lana's heart skipped a beat. "What is that?" "Not sure," Jamie said, her fingers dancing over the console. "It's coming from below. Deep, very deep." Carver stood up, moving toward the sonar station with a look of growing excitement. "Could be something we've never seen before. Prepare for a closer pass." Lana shot him a sharp glance, but Carver was already lost in his obsession. She felt the pull of something ancient and unfathomable tugging at the edges of her mind, as if the trench itself was breathing, alive with secrets it had kept for millions of years. Her gut told her to pull back, but Carver was already moving, steering the submersible down further, closer to the pulse. "Wait," Bill called suddenly, his voice tense. "This isn't right. We shouldn't." But Carver was already pushing the controls forward, ignoring the warning in Bill's voice. Then, just as the pulse reached its crescendo, the world outside the viewport exploded in a wash of strange light, a bioluminescent flare that lit the ocean around them in surreal, shifting hues. For a moment, the world outside seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. And then the pulse stopped. The light faded. The sea fell back into a suffocating silence. "Do you see that?" Carver whispered, his voice barely audible. Lana stared out the viewport, her breath caught in her throat. There, at the very edge of their vision, something massive shifted in the darkness. Something alive. Lana's heart pounded in her chest as her eyes strained to pierce the suffocating darkness outside the viewport. The eerie, bioluminescent flare that had momentarily lit the abyss seemed to have vanished as quickly as it appeared. All that remained was the oppressive blackness of the Mariana Trench, a silence that seemed to swallow every sound, every thought. "What the hell was that?" Jamie muttered from the equipment station, her fingers hovering nervously over the controls. Carver, standing in front of the viewport, didn't answer immediately. His gaze was locked on the shifting blackness, eyes narrowed in a mixture of awe and disbelief. His breath seemed to have caught in his throat, as if he were holding it in, waiting for something. The submersible drifted forward, its engines barely making a sound, as if afraid to disturb the unnatural stillness. Lana glanced at Bill, who had grown visibly pale. His hand gripped the edge of his seat so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Elias, this isn't right," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to pull back. We've already pushed too far." Carver didn't respond. His attention was entirely consumed by whatever lay beyond the steel hull, something that had caught his attention with a force Lana couldn't yet understand. She felt a cold knot form in her stomach, the same feeling she'd had when she first saw the trench's uncharted depth on the map. The deeper they went, the more the world above seemed to shrink away. The silence outside felt almost personal. "We're close," Carver finally whispered, barely audible. "Closer than anyone has ever been. We're on the verge of understanding something no one has ever understood." Lana's breath quickened, but she pushed her anxiety aside. She had seen Carver like this before, so consumed by discovery that he would ignore all caution, all reason, in the pursuit of knowledge. But this wasn't just another uncharted reef or mysterious species. This felt different. There was something wrong here. Her mind raced back to the sonar pulse, that rhythmic beat, the pulse they had followed deeper and deeper into the unknown. And now, whatever it was waiting for them. "Do you see it?" Carver asked softly, his voice almost reverent. Lana leaned closer to the viewport, her forehead pressing against the glass. The light from their submersible illuminated only a few meters of the surrounding water. The edges of the dark ocean seemed to pull away, impossibly far, as if the void was stretching endlessly into infinity. The faintest shimmer appeared on the periphery of her vision, something too large to be ignored, but too far away to identify. Her breath caught in her throat. There, in the deep, a silhouette emerged, something impossibly vast, its form hovering just beyond the reach of the submersible's limited light. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed to pulse with the same bioluminescence they had seen earlier, only its glow was faint, irregular, and cold. It was immense, but not in the way of a whale or giant squid. This was something older, something more ancient than anything they had encountered before. Is it moving? Lana whispered, her voice trembling. It was hard to tell. The silhouette seemed to sway gently, but the ocean around them was so still it was impossible to know for sure. Then, without warning, a single elongated tendril reached out from the dark form. It was long, impossibly thin, and glowed with an unsettling light. It extended, then coiled like a slow-motion strike, wrapping around an unseen object in the water, pulling it toward the dark shape. "Oh God," Jamie gasped, her eyes wide with horror. "What is that?" Lana could hardly breathe. There were no words for what she was seeing. The object being dragged toward the unknown entity was obscured, but it looked wrong. It wasn't any known marine life. The shape seemed to flicker and bend, shifting in ways that defied any natural movement she'd ever known. Carver stood frozen, mesmerized, staring as though he were witnessing a revelation. But Bill couldn't hold his fear in any longer. "We need to go up," Bill said, his voice sharp, commanding. He stood abruptly, his face pale. "This is beyond us. This is not what we signed up for." Lana's heart thudded against her ribs. She knew Bill was right, but there was no way Carver would turn back now, not when they were so close. They had come to uncover the mysteries of the abyss, and for Carver, this was the moment. "Elias," Lana said, her voice firm despite the fear rising in her chest. "We can't stay here. We don't know what that thing is." Carver finally tore his eyes from the viewport, though his expression was almost one of sorrow, as though he were being asked to leave behind something too precious to abandon. "We need to see more," he said softly, the words heavy with an almost childlike wonder. "We're on the edge of history. You don't understand, Lana. This is it. This is the discovery that will change everything." "Elias," Bill's voice cut through, and for the first time, there was real panic in his tone. "It's not worth it. We don't know what that thing is. We don't even know if it's alive." But Carver, lost in his obsession, moved toward the controls without another word. He ignored Bill's protestations, the mounting fear in the air. As if caught in a trance, he guided the submersible closer to the shadowed form, the water growing colder and darker with every passing second. Lana felt her pulse quicken, her instincts screaming at her to stop him. But before she could say anything more, the sonar system let out a sharp, urgent ping, so loud it nearly rattled her teeth. It was not just a signal, it was a warning. "Look," Jamie shouted, pointing to the screen. The deep-sea radar blared, a flurry of erratic signals bouncing wildly, impossibly fast. It wasn't just the pulse they had been tracking, it was everywhere. The entire trench seemed to be alive with motion, as if the ocean itself was stirring. Lana's stomach churned. This wasn't a simple organism or discovery. This was something vast, something with a presence that spanned the entire trench. And then, as if in answer to their intrusion, the glowing form shifted. It was too large, too ancient to fathom. The tendrils grew, and the ocean around them seemed to pulse, as though the very water was breathing. And then, something inside the submersible clicked, a low, deep sound that resonated in the bones of everyone on board. The voice of the abyss had spoken. The submersible rocked gently, as if the ocean itself were shifting its weight around them. The sudden, deep rumble that had reverberated through the hull echoed in their bones, leaving a cold, insistent tremor in the air. Lana's pulse thrummed in her ears, and the heavy, claustrophobic atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. What the hell was that sound? Bill's voice cracked, his grip tight on the console as his knuckles whitened. Carver didn't answer immediately. His fingers were poised above the controls. but his gaze remained fixed on the dark expanse outside the viewport. The strange, eerie glow from the colossal creature had faded, leaving only the faintest traces in the distance. But something in the water had changed. It was like the trench itself had stirred, a sleeping giant waking after an eternity of slumber. Lana's throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "We need to get out of here, Elias. Whatever that was, it wasn't just some deep-sea creature. It felt different. Different." Carver's voice was low, almost dreamlike. "No, it was exactly what we've been searching for. He hesitated, but only for a second. It's a connection to something beyond us." Lana shot him a glare, but he didn't see it. He was already lost in his own thoughts, lost in the obsession that had brought them here. Carver was no longer in the moment with them. He was alone, immersed in the same madness that had always driven his research. "Elias." Bill started again, but his voice faltered. He stood up abruptly, gripping the back of his seat as if needing support. "I don't care what you think is down here. We are not prepared for this." Jamie, still at the controls, slowly turned her head toward the others. Her expression was tight, but fear danced in her eyes. We had been silent since the event, focusing on the instruments, but now the quiet was breaking her. "I don't like this," Jamie murmured, her fingers hovering over the systems, but she didn't touch anything. "Something is not right. I've never seen sonar readings like that, and whatever we just heard, it's not something natural." Carver looked over his shoulder at Jamie, but his face showed no concern. "It's all part of the plan. We knew this would be risky." He turned back to the controls, his hands hovering just above the panel. "But we're on the verge of understanding something no one else has. We can't pull back now. We've made contact." Lana's stomach churned. It was one thing to be exploring the deep for the sake of knowledge. It was quite another to be caught in a game that she felt was quickly spiraling out of control. Without warning, the sonar system blared again, louder this time, and Jamie's hand jerked back from the controls as if the system had shocked her. "What the hell?" Jamie whispered, staring at the screen with wide eyes. The blips on the sonar had multiplied, and this time they were too numerous to ignore. They were not just moving, they were converging on their position. A swarm of signals, each one larger, more densely packed than anything they had seen before. "Something's coming," Bill murmured. His voice was hoarse, and his face was pale, the fear now evident in every line of his expression. The deep rumble from earlier sounded again, louder and more insistent, this time causing the entire submersible to shudder. The hull groaned, as though the ocean itself was pressing in against them. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the cabin, and for a moment, it felt as if the walls were closing in. Lana swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she spoke, her voice tight. "We need to move now. Get us out of here, Elias. Whatever it is, it's not friendly." Carver's face was set in a mask of determination, but for the first time, there was something more than simple fascination in his expression. There was fear. A flicker of doubt crossed his eyes, but it was gone so quickly that Lana couldn't be sure if she had seen it at all. He turned back to the controls and began to pull the submersible upward, but the vibrations in the hull didn't cease. The pressure outside was mounting, building steadily with each passing second. The dark mass that had been hovering in the distance now seemed to be moving, its movements shifting from a vague silhouette to something more definite, something much closer. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sonar signal went dead. The screen flickered and then went black. Jamie let out a sharp breath, her hand hovering over the now unresponsive equipment. "It's gone. We're blind." A cold panic gripped Lana's chest, tightening like a vice. "How can it just vanish like that?" "The whole trench is alive with it," Bill said, voice cracking. "We're surrounded. We're not alone here." Lana's eyes scanned the room for any sign of a way out. The submersible small control room suddenly felt even more claustrophobic, its walls pressing in like a tomb. There was no escape, not until they made it back to the surface, and that could be hours, if not longer. The rumble came again, closer this time, almost deafening. The hull creaked, groaned under the unimaginable weight pressing down on it from all sides. It felt like the ocean itself was reaching for them, its massive, unseen arms wrapped tightly around the submersible, pulling it deeper. "We need to ascend," Bill shouted, his voice rising in panic. "It's not just one thing down there. It's a whole damn colony." Carver's eyes flicked toward him, but there was no trace of fear in his gaze. Instead, his lips curled into a quiet smile, one that made Lana's blood run cold. "This is the discovery," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "The connection." Before anyone could react, the lights inside the submersible flickered one last time, casting the room in a brief, flickering darkness. Then, as the light returned, there was something outside, something massive and dark. A tendril, a thick, glowing mass, had coiled around the submersible's hull, squeezing it like a vice. The submersible shook violently. The submersible shook again, more violently this time, as if something immense and invisible was pressing down on it, squeezing it from all sides. The lights flickered once more, casting the room into brief, strobing shadows. The walls groaned under the weight of the pressure, a low, suffocating sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Lana's heart raced. She gripped her seat tightly, bracing herself as the rumble outside grew louder, closer. Whatever was out there, whatever it was, had found them, and it wasn't going to let them go. "Elias," Bill's voice cracked with panic. "What the hell is happening? We need to get out of here now." Carver was standing by the controls, his hands steady despite the chaos. He was calm, too calm, as if he were lost in the discovery rather than the danger they were facing. His eyes glinted with a strange, manic excitement as he studied the instruments in front of him. "They're here," Carver said softly, his voice low, almost reverent. "The connection has been made." Lana could barely comprehend his words, her thoughts racing too fast. She could see the terror in Bill's eyes, could hear the fear in Jamie's shallow breathing, but Carver wasn't fazed. He was focused, obsessed. It was as if he was being pulled into the abyss with every passing second. "Elias, we need to leave. It's too late for whatever this is," Lana said, her voice tight with the urgency that was now thrumming through her body. "You can't just keep going." But Carver didn't answer. Instead, his hands flew over the controls, pushing the submersible deeper into the trench. Lana's stomach churned with fear. Every instinct screamed for them to pull back, to escape before it was too late. Another violent shake racked the submersible, and this time the strain was too much. A crack echoed through the walls, sharp and unsettling, like the breaking of something fragile. The lights flickered once again, casting the room into pitch-black darkness for a split second. And then they came back on. The shape outside the viewport had grown enormously. It was massive now, a twisting mass of shadows and flickering, unnatural light. The tendrils that had first brushed the hull were everywhere now, coiling around them like the fingers of a giant, unseen hand. It was alive. The water outside was no longer still. It was moving, swirling, as though the trench itself had become a living organism. The submersible seemed to be at the mercy of the abyss, helpless, caught in the embrace of something ancient, something incomprehensible. Lana felt the cold grip of terror in her chest, spreading through her limbs like ice. She tried to breathe, but the air in the submersible was thick with fear, with a weight that pressed down on her lungs. The deep, rumbling sound filled the cabin again, and this time it was accompanied by a low, guttural hum, a voice, perhaps, or something close to it. But it wasn't a voice any human could understand. "We're trapped," Jamie whispered, her voice thin and shaky. "We're not going to make it. We're going to die down here," Bill muttered, his face pale as a sheet, his body trembling in the small space. "No," Carver said, his voice cold, almost detached. "This is the beginning. This is the discovery." Lana stared at him, her mind racing. Carver had always been obsessed with the abyss, with the idea that there was something older, more powerful than humanity. But this wasn't just an unknown species. This was something that should not exist. The tendrils outside pulsed and shifted, their glow flickering in time with the deep, rumbling hum. The pressure outside seemed to increase, and the submersible groaned under the strain, the hull creaking like an old ship about to sink. Suddenly, the view outside the viewport shifted again. The dark mass that had loomed on the edge of their vision was no longer distant. It was right there, just beyond the thin steel of the submersible's hull. And it was enormous. Lana could make out strange, shifting patterns in the mass, like an endless swirling of lights, like the stars themselves were caught in the depths. And then it moved. The tendrils uncoiled, and in one swift motion, they wrapped around the submersible with terrifying speed, tightening around the hull as if trying to crush it. The submersible lurched violently, and the metal groaned in protest. The crew was thrown forward, the entire cabin buckling under the pressure. Lana felt her body slam against the wall. The breath was knocked out of her, and for a moment, everything went dark. When she regained consciousness, the room was spinning. The lights were flickering wildly, and the hum outside had turned into a shrill, high-pitched wail. The submersible's instruments were blinking erratically. The pressure was growing unbearable. But worse than the pressure was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that something was inside the submersible with them. Something ancient, something hungry. "Lana!" Bill screamed, his voice raw with fear. "We have to go now. We need to escape." But there was no way out. The trench was too deep, and the creature outside was too vast. Every attempt to move the submersible was met with resistance. The tendrils outside pulsed with incredible force, dragging them back down. Lana's hands shook as she reached for the controls, but the panic in her chest made it hard to focus. They were trapped. They were no longer in control of their fate. The abyss had claimed them. And then, just as suddenly as the shaking had started, the submersible stilled. The rumbling, the wailing, the pounding pressure all ceased. The cabin fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. "What's happening?" Jamie whispered, her voice barely audible. Lana peered out the viewport, her heart still pounding in her chest. The mass was gone. The tendrils had retreated into the abyss, and the ocean around them was once again still. But that silence was deafening. "Is it gone?" Bill asked, voice hoarse. Lana didn't answer. She could feel it in her bones. It wasn't gone. The creature had retreated, yes, but it wasn't finished with them. It was waiting, and they had just made contact with something beyond their understanding. The real horror had only just begun. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Every breath felt like an effort, and the weight of the ocean pressing down on them was more oppressive than ever. The submersible floated eerily still in the deep, the gentle hum of its machinery, the only sound that seemed to break through the thick, oppressive quiet. Lana's eyes remained fixed on the viewport, but she wasn't seeing the dark waters outside anymore. Her mind was racing, swirling with the terrifying images of what they had just experienced. The creature, or creatures, out there, the tendrils, the deep rumbling hum. It was too much to process all at once. She felt like she was on the edge of something she could never fully understand, and that thought made her want to curl up and shut it all out. But she couldn't. Not when they were still trapped down here. Bill's voice broke the silence, rough and trembling. What the hell was that? His words were almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile moment of quiet they were caught in. What did we just encounter? We didn't encounter anything, Carver said, his voice almost cold. He was still standing by the controls, his hands unmoving, but his eyes were distant, lost in thought. That was just the beginning. It's watching us. Lana's pulse spiked at the words. "What do you mean, watching us?" she demanded, her voice sharp despite the growing fear. That thing, or whatever it is, was right outside the hull. It almost crushed us. It's not just observing us, it's trying to kill us. Carver turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. "No, Lana, it was testing us. It knows we're here, but it hasn't made its move yet. It's waiting for us to understand." "Understand what?" Jamie's voice was barely audible, but it carried the edge of panic. She was still sitting at the equipment station, her hands shaking as she tried to recalibrate the instruments, but nothing was responding properly. What the hell could we possibly understand about that? Lana's mind was racing. She couldn't ignore the feeling in her gut, the instinct that told her something more was coming. Something worse. The submersible silence was maddening, and every fiber of her being screamed for escape, for safety, but the reality was too stark. The way out was above them, but they couldn't ascend fast enough to escape whatever was hunting them. "We need to go up," Bill said again, more urgently this time. "We're sitting ducks down here. We don't even know what that thing is or what it wants, but if we stay much longer..." "Enough!" Carver snapped, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We cannot leave. Not yet. You think we've survived all this just to turn back now? We're on the brink of something monumental." Lana felt the stirrings of something cold creeping through her veins, something more dangerous than fear. Carver's obsession with this place had always been unsettling, but now it was clear that he had crossed the line. He wasn't concerned about their safety anymore. He was too fixated on the discovery, too consumed by whatever connection he thought he had made with the abyss. "Elias, listen to me," Lana said, her voice shaking but steady. "We can't keep going down this path. The trench, it's not just a place. It's something alive, and we've made it aware of us. That thing outside, it wasn't a test. It was a warning." Carver stared at her for a long moment, and for a brief instant, Lana thought he might finally listen. But then he shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. "You don't understand, Lana," he said softly. "This isn't a warning. This is an invitation." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Lana stood frozen, unable to speak for a moment. An invitation? What the hell was he talking about? The cold grip of dread tightened around her chest. Suddenly, a sharp, mechanical noise broke through the silence, a high-pitched whine from the submersible systems. Jamie jumped, her eyes wide with alarm. "What the hell is that?" she exclaimed. The instruments flickered erratically, then went dead. Lana's heart stopped. "No," she whispered, eyes wide. "No, no, no." "It's happened," Carver said, his voice a low murmur. "The connection has been made." "What the hell does that mean?" Bill shouted, his eyes wild with panic. "You don't understand. We're not in control anymore." Lana's eyes darted to the viewport again, her mind racing. Whatever had been out there, whatever was still lurking in the depths, had noticed them, and now was toying with them. And then, with a suddenness that made her heart leap in her throat, the sonar systems came back online. But this time, the readings were different. The blips were larger, but scattered in a way that made no sense. They were no longer individual creatures. They were linked, connected in ways that defied reason. The pulses on the screen were coming from all directions, growing stronger with every passing second. "No," Jamie whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, no, no." Lana's eyes scanned the screen, but it was Carver who spoke first. "They're here," he said, his voice breathy with excitement. "All of them." Before anyone could react, the submersible shuddered once again, but this time, it wasn't the pressure of the ocean. It was something different, a vibration, a hum that seemed to come from deep inside the earth, rippling through the water, through the very structure of the submersible. And then, from the depths outside the viewport, a flash of light. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was enough to make the crew fall silent. Lana pressed her face against the glass, straining to see what it was. The deep blackness of the trench seemed to stretch on forever, but now there was movement. Slow, deliberate. Shadows moving against the inky darkness, almost like eyes that were watching them. Carver's voice broke the silence again, his words thick with awe. "We've made contact. This is it. We've seen them." Lana felt a chill crawl down her spine. She wanted to scream, to demand that they turn back, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew it was too late. The thing that had been waiting for them was no longer just outside the hull. It was inside their minds. The air inside the submersible was thick with the faint smell of metal and the staleness of trapped oxygen. But it wasn't the stale air or the overwhelming silence that was suffocating them now. It was something far worse. The hum was back. Not the rumbling vibrations they had felt earlier, the deep, foreboding tremors from the ocean's depths, but something different. A high-pitched, almost electric frequency that buzzed through the air, reverberating inside their skulls. The sound wasn't coming from the submersible systems. It was from within. Lana pressed her hands against her temples, trying to block out the noise that seemed to crawl into her mind like a swarm of insects. She felt dizzy, disoriented, as though the very fabric of reality was fraying at the edges. And then, for the briefest moment, it stopped. Silence. But this silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. Lana's breath came out in shallow gasps. Her thoughts felt fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror, each reflection slightly off. She turned toward the others, but their faces seemed distant, as though they were far away, unreachable. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice shaking. Bill was staring at the console, his face pale, eyes wide. His hands gripped the edge of his seat, like he was holding on for dear life. "It's not just a noise," he whispered hoarsely. "It's something else. It's in my head." Carver stood at the helm, completely still, his eyes glazed over as he stared into the void outside. His lips moved, but there were no words, just a low, soft muttering that blended with the hum. It sounded like a chant, or maybe it was a prayer, but it wasn't in any language Lana recognized. "Elias," she said, her voice strained. "What the hell is happening? We can't just sit here like this." Carver's head snapped toward her, his eyes unfocused but gleaming with a strange fervor. "It's already happening," he murmured, as if he were speaking to himself. "You just don't understand. We're being changed. You all feel it, don't you?" Lana's stomach turned. "Changed? What the hell do you mean, changed?" Before Carver could respond, the submersible shuddered again, this time with a violent force that rattled the entire structure. The lights flickered once more, casting long, twitching shadows across the cabin. And then the hum returned, but this time it was louder, closer. The very air around them seemed to vibrate with it, and it felt as though the hum was deep inside their bones, gnawing at their nerves. Lana's heart raced, her vision blurred, and she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She staggered backward, clutching at her seat for support, but her hands were slick with sweat. Someone was reaching for her, but it wasn't through her eyes. It was through her mind, through the very essence of who she was. "Lana." The voice was faint at first, barely a whisper against the growing hum. "Lana, you know." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't coming from any of the crew. It was something else. It was low, reverberating deep within her skull, like the murmur of 1,000 voices overlapping each other. It was a strange, foreign sound, like the soft creaking of the ocean's deepest trench. And then clearer, more distinct. "We've been waiting for you." Her hands flew to her ears as if she could drown it out, but the voice only grew stronger, louder, more insistent. It wasn't just inside her mind anymore. It was all around her, pressing in from every direction. The words swam through her consciousness, wrapping around her thoughts, changing them. She couldn't think straight. She couldn't focus on anything but the voice that seemed to call to her, tugging at the deepest corners of her being. "Lana! Lana!" She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The others, Bill, Jamie, were shouting, their voices faint against the overwhelming roar of the hum. Carver was muttering to himself, his eyes wide, his hands twitching. He was lost in it. All of them were lost in it. And then, without warning, the hum ceased. The silence came crashing down with such force that it felt like her ears were ringing. Her body was trembling, and she could feel the cold sweat dripping down her neck. She stared at her trembling hands, trying to regain control, but the voice was still there, echoing inside her skull. "Lana." The voice whispered, softer now, as if it was speaking directly to her soul. "It's too late to leave." A deep, gut-wrenching cold swept over her, and suddenly, the walls of the submersible felt too close. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't escape. Lana looked at the others, her voice barely audible. "What? What is this?" Carver finally turned to her, his face expressionless, save for the gleam in his eye. He wasn't the same person anymore. His voice was calm, almost serene. "It's what we came for. Don't you see? We've crossed into a place beyond human comprehension. It's opening up to us, to me, and I understand now." "You understand what?" Bill shouted, his face twisted in fear and disbelief. "You're out of your mind. We need to get back to the surface. We need to get away from this, whatever this is." But Carver was shaking his head slowly. "You don't understand, Bill. We're not getting away. We're part of it now. We've been chosen." Lana's breath hitched. "Chosen?" Before she could speak, a faint light flickered from outside the viewport. It was distant at first, just a faint glow beneath the blackness of the ocean. But as the seconds ticked by, it grew larger, brighter, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. And then the light moved. It surged toward them, fast, impossibly fast. Lana felt her heart pound in her chest, her stomach flipping with dread. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The glow was coming for them. It was something more than just light. It was alive, sentient, and it was coming for them, drawn to the connection they had made. Carver's smile twisted into something unholy, his eyes wide with elation. "It's here. We're finally seen." Lana's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched the light surge toward them. Whatever it was, whatever Carver had awakened, it was here now, and there was no escaping it. The abyss had claimed them, and they were about to face the full extent of its power. The submersible was no longer just a vehicle. It was a prison, a cage of metal and glass, suspended in the endless dark. The walls felt closer, oppressive, as if the ocean was pushing in on them from all sides, pressing them into submission. The hum still echoed in their minds, relentless and inescapable, worming its way into their consciousness with an insidious persistence. Lana was no longer sure what was real. She had always prided herself on her grounded nature, her ability to focus and think logically in moments of crisis. But now, the line between reality and nightmare blurred. The glow outside the viewport grew brighter, larger, pulsing with an unsettling rhythm that seemed to sync with the beating of her own heart. It was alive, she could feel it. Carver was staring out of the viewport, his face alight with a disturbing fascination. His eyes were wide, almost unblinking, as if he were being drawn into the very heart of the phenomenon. He was beyond reasoning now. His obsession had turned into something darker, more consuming. We're chosen," he murmured, almost to himself. "We've crossed the threshold. This is what we were meant to find." Lana's voice broke through the suffocating silence. "Carver, you don't get it. We're not chosen. We're being used." Carver turned slowly, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, but more of an understanding. "You don't understand. It understands. We were always meant to find it." Bill and Jamie were seated at their stations, shaking, unable to tear their eyes away from the viewport. Jamie had stopped trying to operate the controls entirely. She was staring blankly at the glowing light outside, her expression frozen in fear. Bill had his hands gripped tightly around his seat, his knuckles white. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "I don't care what it is," Bill rasped, his voice hoarse. "We need to get the hell out of here." Lana could feel the panic rising in her chest, choking her. "We can't. It's not just outside anymore. It's inside us. We can't escape this. It's in our heads." Suddenly, the submersible shuddered again, this time more violently. The metal groaned, and the faint hum grew to an overwhelming crescendo. Lana could feel the vibrations all around her, in the walls, in the floor beneath her feet. It was as though the entire vessel was alive, breathing. The light outside the viewport surged forward, now blinding in its intensity. It was no longer a distant glow, but a massive, pulsing presence that pressed against the very edges of the submersible. It felt as though it were pushing through the glass, filling the space with an oppressive, suffocating energy. Lana could see movement within the light, twisting, writhing shapes that didn't make sense. They were there and gone in the blink of an eye, but the impression they left was enough to freeze her in place. The shapes were familiar in a way that made her blood run cold, but their true form was beyond human comprehension. Their very existence bent the laws of reality. "It is coming for us," Jamie whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't escape it. We're already part of it." "Stop," Bill shouted, his voice raw. "We're not part of it. We're human. We can't just give in to this madness." But even as he spoke, Lana could see the cracks beginning to form in his resolve. The look in his eyes was no longer the same. The glow outside, the thing they had awoken, was in them now, eating away at their sanity. Carver was smiling now, a slow, serene smile that sent chills down Lana's spine. "We're not meant to leave, Bill. It doesn't want us to. We're the ones who brought it here. We're part of its design, and it's been waiting for us." Lana's hands gripped the edge of her seat. No, we're not part of it. This is wrong. Everything about this is wrong." But Carver's gaze didn't waver. "You don't get it. You'll understand soon enough." And then, with a suddenness that sent a shockwave through the submersible, the lights flickered and went out entirely. The deep blackness that enveloped them was absolute. Panic spread through the crew like wildfire. Lana gasped for air, her breathing erratic. She could feel the pulse of the abyssal hum still thrumming in her mind, but it was as though it was coming from within her, rising from the deepest recesses of her subconscious. Then the lights came back on, just for a split second, revealing a sight that burned itself into her memory forever. Through the viewport, the glowing mass that had surrounded them had coalesced into a shape, a massive, undulating form that seemed to shift with impossible fluidity. It was alive, it was aware, and it was waiting. Lana's scream caught in her throat as she stared into the darkness beyond the glass. The entity was no longer just a distant presence. It was within the submersible now, pressing in on every side, reaching out to them with tendrils of light, its true form beyond the grasp of their understanding. The pulse of its energy was so intense that it almost felt like it was tearing at the fabric of reality itself. But then, in that instant, Carver's voice broke through the chaos, calm and unbroken. "It's asking us to join. It's offering us a chance to become more." Lana couldn't breathe. "Join? You're insane. It's consuming us." But Carver wasn't listening. He stood up slowly, almost reverently, his body swaying with the rhythm of the pulse. "It's not consuming us, Lana. It's awakening us. We're finally part of something bigger than ourselves." The submersible lurched again. This time, the force was overwhelming. The walls creaked and groaned under pressure, and the lights flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows that danced along the walls. And then, suddenly, with a deafening crack, one of the viewing ports exploded outward, the glass shattering in an instant. The void beyond surged into the cabin, filling the space with a force that left no room for air. The entity was here. The abyss had claimed them, its reach extending far beyond the physical boundaries of the submersible. Lana's screams were swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. The last thing, she saw the shadowy figures emerging from the light, stretching toward her, pulling her into the depths. The submersible's cabin was alive with the shriek of metal twisting under pressure, as if the very structure of the vessel was rebelling against the forces it could no longer contain. Lana could feel it in her bones, the cold, gnawing pull from the depths, from the blackness that stretched infinitely beyond the fragile walls of their prison. The glass viewport had shattered with a deafening crack, and the crushing darkness flooded in, momentarily swallowing all light. But it was more than darkness. It was a presence, a thing that she couldn't fully understand and didn't want to. It was closing in on them. The hum had become a roar, a deafening sound that vibrated in every corner of the vessel, pulsing through her skull, through her very thoughts. It was a sound that carried with it an impossible weight, a weight that pressed against her chest and stole her breath. She gasped, clutching her seat as her mind spiraled. Lana's body trembled as she tried to push herself back into reality, but she wasn't sure where reality even was anymore. Carver stood as though mesmerized at the center of the cabin, his eyes still locked on the vast, dark void outside, his face awash with awe. The glow from the abyss flickered across his features, casting long, unnatural shadows. He was lost. Carver, Lana cried, her voice breaking through the suffocating hum. This isn't you. We have to get out of here. Now! But Carver didn't move. He was beyond her reach, beyond any help she could offer. His body swayed as if in tune with the pulse, his eyes vacant, lost to whatever it was that had taken hold of him. "We are chosen, Lana," he murmured, his voice distant and calm, almost a chant. "We are meant to merge with it, to become part of the greater whole." Lana recoiled. "No, we're being consumed. You don't understand. This thing doesn't care about us. We're just food, just tools." But Carver didn't seem to hear her. His gaze never wavered from the abyss, from the shifting, undulating light that seemed to beckon them towards something much worse than death. Jamie had risen from her seat. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unfocused. She stumbled toward the broken viewport, as though drawn by some unseen force. "It's here," she whispered, almost reverently. "It's finally here." The others, Bill and Jamie, were slipping away too, their minds fraying under the pressure of whatever influenced the entity wielded. Their hands twitched, their bodies swayed, and they muttered to themselves in fragmented, incoherent sentences. The voices of their thoughts were distorted now, no longer their own. They were speaking in tones that weren't theirs, repeating words that seemed to come from the void itself. "It's all around us," Jamie muttered. "We are one." Bill's eyes darted nervously from one person to the next. "This isn't right. None of this is right." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The hum was overwhelming, seeping into every thought. Even as his words left his mouth, the light in his eyes dimmed. Lana's pulse thundered in her ears as she realized they were gone. The crew she had worked with, the people she had trusted, were no longer there. They had been lost to the abyss, claimed by whatever was outside, by the vast, incomprehensible force that had reached into their minds and twisted them. The light outside the viewport intensified. The glow had no source. It just was existing in the blackness, pulsing like a heartbeat. The shapes within the light shifted once more, forming and reforming in ways that defied all logic. They were alive, whatever they were aware. They were waiting. Lana fought the urge to scream as she felt the pull growing stronger. She could almost hear it now, not just in her mind, but from the very depths outside. A low whisper that began as a hum, then morphed into words. Her heart raced, pounding in her chest, her throat tightening with panic. Lana, the voice, deep and resonant, filled her ears, pulling her closer to the edge of madness. It wasn't a language she could understand. It was a feeling. It was as if the very fabric of her being was being unraveled, thread by thread. "Lana, come to us." "No," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "No, I won't. I won't." But the words came anyway, as if the voice had broken into her thoughts, infecting them with an impossible truth. "You were always meant to find us. You are part of this now, whether you accept it or not." A sickening realization hit her then. This was no ordinary entity. It wasn't just some alien intelligence or ancient god. It was something older, something more primal. It had existed long before humanity, before all life. And now it had found them, found her. It had been waiting patiently for millennia, and now they had opened the door for it to enter their reality. The submersible shook again, more violently this time, and Lana lost her balance, tumbling to the floor as the pressure inside the cabin mounted. The lights flickered one last time before going out completely. The hum, the oppressive, soul-crushing hum, was the only sound now, the only thing that made sense in the madness. Lana's hands trembled as she crawled toward the controls, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to do something, anything. She couldn't just sit here and let them all die. She couldn't let this thing take over. But the submersible was beyond her control. Whatever had happened, whatever had been unleashed, had already taken root. the walls groaned again, this time with a deep, wet sound, as though something inside the vessel was pushing against it. Something organic, alive. The metal bent, warping under pressure, as though the very structure of the submersible was being twisted by unseen hands. And then she heard it, a soft, wet slithering sound. Something was moving beneath the floor. Her eyes widened in horror as the walls around her seemed to ripple, and something dark, something alive, began to creep through the seams of the cabin. It was like liquid darkness, flowing in from the cracks and crevices, reaching for her. It was coming for her. Lana tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed, her hands slipping on the floor as she scrambled away from the creeping shadows. She had to get out. She had to survive. And then, in the darkest corner of the cabin, the voice came again. Louder this time, more insistent. "Lana, join us." The abyss was no longer outside. It was inside. It had already consumed them. And now, it was coming for her. Lana's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled backward, her heart thudding in her chest like a war drum. The shadows slithered across the floor like liquid darkness, spreading in every direction, creeping closer, reaching for her. Her hands grasped at the edges of the seat, trying to push herself away, but the thing that had overtaken the submersible was already inside her mind, sinking its tendrils into her thoughts. It was inescapable. Her vision swam with the distorted shapes, and the haunting voice echoed through her skull, louder now, as though the abyss itself was trying to tear her apart. "Join us," the voice whispered again, cold and alluring. "You were meant to be one of us. Come to us, Lana." Her mind screamed in defiance, but her body felt heavy, sluggish, as though the very atmosphere around her was thickening, becoming something she couldn't fight. The walls around her seemed to close in, bending unnaturally as the vessel groaned in protest. It was as if the submersible itself were becoming alive, a creature whose veins pulsed with the entity's power. "It's not real," Lana whispered to herself, her voice barely more than a breath. "None of this is real." But her words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what was happening, what they had awoken. The submersible was no longer just a ship. It was a prison, a tomb. A metallic screech sounded, and the walls of the cabin buckled inward, as if an invisible hand was pressing against them from outside. Lana scrambled to her feet, her fingers numb with fear, trying desperately to hold on to something, anything. But it was useless. The hum, that relentless, suffocating pulse, filled her ears, and the pressure mounted until her very bones ached under its weight. She couldn't breathe. Lana gasped for air, but it was no use. It felt like the oxygen was being stolen from her lungs. Her vision blurred as panic seized her chest, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She needed to think. She needed to act. But what could she do? The submersible was a coffin, and the entity, whatever it was, had already claimed it. The thought of Carver, of Jamie, of Bill, all of them consumed by this unfathomable force, made her sick. They had all been so easily taken, so willing. It was as if their minds had been stripped away, leaving nothing behind but husks, puppets of an ancient, incomprehensible power. But not her. She wouldn't let it take her. A soft, rasping noise broke her from her thoughts. Somewhere in the depths of the submersible, something was moving. Not just the shadows, but something more solid. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to know what it was. But the pull of curiosity, the pull of fear, drove her to it. With trembling hands, she activated the emergency flashlight at her side. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a long, twisted shape that seemed to pulse in time with the hum. It was a mass of writhing, black tendrils that stretched across the walls, dripping with some viscous substance that glistened in the faint light. The tendrils twisted, contracted, and reached for her as though they recognized her presence. "No," Lana whispered hoarsely. "Please, no." But it was too late. The darkness in the cabin seemed to fold, rippling as the shadows became thick, almost tangible. The hum rose to an unbearable pitch, and the walls shuddered again. Lana's vision flickered, and for a moment, the entire world around her seemed to distort and stretch like a nightmare, bending reality itself. And then, in a split second of clarity, he saw it. The thing that had been waiting outside the submersible, the entity she had unwittingly awakened, was now inside. It was everywhere. It had no single form, but it was something vast, something older than anything she could fathom. Its presence filled every corner of the room, pressing in from every direction, suffocating her. Its whispers crawled under her skin. She could hear them now, voices, not just in her head, but in the very fabric of the submersible. The vessel had become a conduit, a vessel for its influence, and she was its next target. You cannot escape, the voice boomed, echoing from every shadow, vibrating in the very air around her. You cannot run from what you have awakened. You are ours now. Lana's mind reeled. The words made no sense, but the feeling behind them did. She was caught. She couldn't escape. Not physically, not mentally. The entity had already infiltrated every part of her being. She could feel its influence stretching into her thoughts, pulling at the very essence of her consciousness. But she couldn't give in. Not yet. Not without a fight. Lana staggered to the control panel. She had to do something, anything. Her hands fumbled over the buttons, searching for any kind of control, but the display was static, flickering, showing nothing but incomprehensible symbols. She pounded the panel in frustration, her breath shallow. The hum grew louder, as if in response to her desperation, and her vision blurred once more. She couldn't think clearly. She couldn't escape. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, the emergency lights flickered to life, casting the submersible in an eerie red glow. The walls, once merely warped and bent, now seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm, as if the very structure of the vessel had become part of the entity, was being remade by it. Lana's pulse quickened. The tendrils on the walls had grown, expanded. They were now moving with purpose, converging on her position. She could feel them, reaching out with an insatiable hunger, dragging the very air toward them, toward their inevitable end. The air around her was thick with the scent of decay. The whole cabin stank of death. And then she saw them. In the far corner, where the shadows once clung to the walls, there were figures. Human figures. Bill, Jamie, Carver. But they weren't human anymore. Not entirely. Their eyes were wide, vacant, hollow. Their bodies were twisted and elongated. Their skin pallid and stretched tight, as though it was not truly theirs. The entity had changed them, molded them into something else. Something new. "Join us," Carver whispered, his voice a broken echo of its former self. His mouth curled into a smile that wasn't his. "Come, be one with us. There is no more fear. There is no more pain. There is only us." Lana's mind screamed for her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The tendrils were already around her, pulling her into their grip, cold and unyielding. The walls seemed to close in on her, the weight of the entity pressing down, crushing her. The whispers were deafening now, and the pressure in her skull was unbearable. And then, in the darkest corner of her mind, a thought broke through. A desperate, fleeting thought. If she couldn't escape, maybe she could understand it. But the thought was swallowed by the crushing darkness before it could take shape. Lana's mind screamed in silence as the tendrils wrapped around her, constricting like 100 cold, wet serpents. The flesh of her arms and legs burned where they touched, and she could feel the unnatural energy of the entity flooding into her veins. It was more than fear now. It was the deep, invasive knowledge that the entity had no intention of simply killing her. It wanted her thoughts, her soul, to consume her, to make her part of its eternal void. She could feel the presence of the others now, Bill, Jamie, Carver standing behind her, watching. Their hollow eyes tracked her movements with an unsettling stillness, as though they were not truly present anymore, only vessels for whatever alien force had swallowed them whole. The space around her seemed to ripple in a sickening, liquid motion, warping reality itself into something alien, alien in a way she couldn't define, only feel. Join us. The voice had once again returned, whispering in her ear, a soft, chilling invitation. You are part of this, Lana. You've always been. Come, and you will no longer feel the burden of your flesh. Come, be one with us. Lana gritted her teeth, her chest heaving with the weight of it all. She had always known that something about this mission was wrong. Something beneath the surface had been waiting for them, calling out to them in ways they couldn't understand. But she never imagined it would be this. A force that transcended the known world. Something so vast and ancient it felt like the very laws of nature bent before it. But as the tendrils tightened around her, she remembered something. A fragment of an old story. Something her grandmother had told her as a child. Something about the old ones, ancient beings from beyond the stars that could bend the minds and wills of men. But there was always a price. The stories were hazy, but the point was clear. To resist them, to break free, one had to find a way to reject the call. But how could she reject it? The creature was too powerful. The vessel was already lost. Her breath quickened as the whisper grew louder, more insistent, vibrating inside her skull. It wanted her to understand. It wanted her to surrender. She could feel the thoughts of the others, Carver's, Jamie's, Bill's, all intertwined with hers, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Their minds were no longer their own. They had surrendered completely. They were no longer human. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. She was weakening. It would take her soon, just like it had taken them. But then a spark. Her eyes darted toward the console, the flickering lights of the emergency systems casting long shadows across the room. For a brief moment, the device seemed alive, not just malfunctioning, but reacting to her presence. It flickered again, and she saw something, a faint image of pattern, a symbol. Lana's heart skipped a beat as recognition struck her. It wasn't just malfunctioning, it was showing her a way out. The signal wasn't coming from the submersible systems. It was coming from the very heart of the abyss. Somehow, through all the chaos, through the terror that was closing in on her, she understood. She didn't know how or why, but she had seen the same symbol just once in the research station's file. It had been connected to old, abandoned theories. Prophecies, maybe. Legends about the ancient ones that had vanished millennia ago. And there was one thing that could possibly repel them. The seal. It had always been a theory, a story until now. She had to act, or she would be lost forever. Ignoring the tendrils that now wrapped around her neck, constricting with chilling force, she focused her mind on the control panel. The symbol on the screen flickered again, and it was as though the system had momentarily opened itself to her, a brief, agonizing opportunity to reverse the entity's hold. The pressure in the room was unbearable, the air thick with the weight of 1,000 voices, but Lana's hand shot out toward the emergency override. There was no time to second guess, no time for hesitation. Her fingers fumbled over the control, sweat beading on her forehead as she slammed the button. The vessel shook violently. A grinding noise reverberated through the hull, and for one fleeting moment, the entire submersible seemed to go still. But then, with a deafening crack, the walls buckled. The very floor beneath her feet seemed to rip apart as something dark and organic surged into the room. Tendrils erupted, lashing out like whips, but Lana was no longer entirely helpless. She could feel it now. The seal she had triggered was breaking the connection. She wasn't sure how it worked, or why it was working, but it was... The walls shuddered and groaned as the dark force recoiled, the unrelenting hum faltering for the first time since they had first encountered it. But it was not over. The vessel was tearing itself apart. The control panel was smoking, crackling with electrical surges as the black liquid spread, leaking from the cracks in the walls and the floor, coiling toward her like a living thing. She had triggered something, and now there would be no going back. Lana's breath came in shallow, desperate gasps as she realized the full truth of what she had done. The seal wasn't just a protection. It was a curse. The ritual that she had activated had done more than stop the entity. It had bound her to it. The entity had marked her. She wasn't sure if she was now its prisoner or its messenger, but she felt the change in her body, the shift in her mind. The connection had been severed for now, but it had left a scar. It was as though something in the very air had wrapped itself around her soul, a whisper in the back of her mind, a voice she could not ignore. And that voice would never stop calling her. Not now, not ever. The air was thick with the scent of decay as the submersible collapsed in on itself, its frame groaning under the pressure. Lana barely had time to register that the walls were finally giving way before the submersible plunged further into the depths, into the crushing blackness. The last thing she saw was the broken, twisted figures of the others, her crew, twisting and convulsing as they were pulled into the dark. And then, as the darkness swallowed her whole, she knew one thing for certain. The entity hadn't just consumed them. It had consumed everything. And now it had her. Lana's body felt weightless as the submersible plummeted deeper, farther into the crushing depths. The vibrations from the hull twisting and cracking beneath the pressure were distant, as though they came from another world. Her senses were dulled, her mind fragmented, as if reality itself was slipping away from her, piece by piece. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the dark water pressing against the walls. Her skin burned where the tendrils had touched her, and though her breath came in short, frantic gasps, she couldn't shake the sensation that something inside her had changed. Something deeper than her body, the core of her very being, had been marked by the entity. The seal had severed the immediate connection, yes, but it hadn't released her from its grip. In the silence that followed the catastrophic rupture, a strange calm settled over Lana. The dark whispers that had filled the cabin seemed to fade, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. But it was an unnatural silence, one that made her feel as though she were no longer alone in her own mind. There was a presence, a shadow in the edges of her consciousness, lurking just out of sight. The faint, echoing hum from before, the pulse of the entity's influence, was still there, but now it was inside her. She raised a hand to her temple, feeling the throbbing pressure against her skull. Her vision swam, blurring and twisting, as though the world itself was warping under the weight of her thoughts. She closed her eyes, but the darkness that enveloped her mind wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, older, and there was a gnawing hunger beneath it, a desire to know. Lana's heart pounded as a vision flashed in her mind's eye. The symbol, that strange, alien mark. It burned brightly against the blackness, pulsating with power. And something else, a vast ocean, stretching to infinity, filled with unknowable shapes. Something was moving in the depths, something far greater than she had ever imagined. And it was watching her. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered again, but this time, it was not just external. It was within her, resonating in her bones. "You are the key. You are ours now." Her breath hitched, and she gasped for air, as if she could expel the words from her lungs. The air felt thinner, heavier, and the pressure from the ocean outside, so immense, so suffocating, seemed to crush against her chest. No, she thought, forcing herself to focus, to resist. "I can't give in, not like the others." But even as she tried to hold on to her defiance, she felt the changes taking root. She could feel it in her veins, creeping through her blood like a sickness. The very walls of the submersible felt alive. The shadows around her seemed to stretch, pulse, and shift. The air itself was thick with the whispers and the overwhelming presence of the entity. The connection was there too, always there. She couldn't escape it. Every thought, every breath she took felt tainted. The darkness pressed against her mind like a weight, threatening to collapse her under its force. And the worst part was that the more she tried to fight it, the more it seemed to intensify. The walls of the cabin groaned as the submersible continued to descend into the abyss. The lights flickered, and the instruments went haywire, feeding back garbled images on the monitors. But there, amidst the static and distortion, Lana saw something, a shape in the distance. Her stomach lurched. It was as if a part of her, deep inside, knew what was coming. The figure was massive, towering, its shape barely discernible through the twisting waters and distortion. But she could sense its presence, feel it like a wave of cold, ancient power radiating toward her. It was the source of the abyss, the heart of the nightmare. It's here. The thought struck her with cold clarity. Her pulse quickened. She had to do something, anything. But what? The submersible was too far gone, and she knew she was too weak to fight the entity directly. It was already inside her, consuming her thoughts. Then, in the distance, something else flickered, a faint light, weak, barely visible through the glass. It wasn't the entity's cold glow. It was something different, something more human. Lana's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? Could anyone have survived? With trembling hands, she reached for the comm system. Static crackled over the speaker, and her heart sank as she realized the system was damaged beyond repair. The darkness around her pressed in, almost suffocating. Her own reflection in the cracked screen seemed to distort and twist into something unrecognizable. And then something whispered, "Come in." The voice wasn't the entity's. It was familiar. The voice was hers, but it wasn't. It came from her own mind, like a shadow, like something calling from the depths. The whispers, the memories, the feelings, it was all intertwined. She was becoming it, piece by piece, her very soul bending under its influence. "You are not just a vessel," the voice inside her whispered. "You are the key. You have always been the key." Her hands gripped the edge of the console, nails biting into the metal as she tried to hold on to her consciousness. Her mind was splitting apart, fragmenting like shattered glass. Was she losing herself? Was this what the others had felt? This hollow sense of being pulled into something greater? Something unknowable? "No," she whispered aloud, her voice hoarse. "I won't be like them. I won't give in." But the voice didn't relent. In fact, it only grew stronger, pushing against the walls of her mind. "You can feel it, can't you? The truth?" Her fingers twitched, and she realized, terrifyingly, that she had just opened a door. A door to something deep inside herself, where the dark influence of the entity had settled. It was always there now, lurking, waiting to take her completely. She slammed her fist against the console, desperate. But in the flickering light, her eyes fell upon the emergency override switch. The one she had used before, the one that had momentarily broken the entity's hold. Her chest tightened with dread. Could she use it again? Was there still time? Or had the entity already fully claimed her? The dark presence swirled in her mind, and for the first time, she realized that she had a choice. A horrible choice. To sever the connection completely would be to end the suffering. But it would also erase what remained of her humanity. But if she didn't, she would be consumed, just like Carver, Jamie, and Bill. The decision felt like a weight that would crush her. Lana's hands shook as she hovered over the emergency override. It gleamed beneath her fingertips, a cruel reminder of the decision she had made moments ago. Her mind screamed at her, torn between the two choices, both equally devastating. If she activated the switch again, she might sever the connection, but at the cost of her own identity, of everything that made her human. She could feel it now, the cold grip of the entity wrapped around her very soul, its hunger gnawing at her insides, pulling at her thoughts like a fisherman reeling in a catch. What if she didn't? The lights flickered again, casting shadows across the control room, and something in the air seemed to shift. The entity's influence was pressing down harder, seeping through the very walls of the submersible. The whispers were louder now, distant but ever present, like a chant, a rhythm that thrummed deep in her chest. "Join us." The voice slithered through her thoughts, curling around her consciousness. "You were always meant to be one with the void. Accept it. Embrace it." Lana recoiled, her teeth gritting against the pull. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing curiosity, the pull that reached into her mind like a magnet to metal. It was offering her something: freedom. She had heard of people who had given in, becoming one with a force that governed the deep oceans, transcending the limitations of flesh. But there was always a cost, always a darkness that awaited. There was no way out. Not without losing herself. Not without. A sudden, violent tremor shook the submersible, throwing Lana to the side. The world around her cracked and groaned, and through the viewport, she saw something, a massive shape, enormous, far too large to be human. Its form was barely visible beneath the murky depths, but the sense of presence was overwhelming. The air grew cold, the pressure in the cabin increasing until it felt like she was being crushed from every side. The thing was there. She could feel its tendrils stretching toward her, its awareness penetrating her mind. The shadow loomed closer. Lana's pulse raced, and in the corner of her vision, she saw the emergency override again, the single button that could change everything. But before she could make a decision, something inside her shifted. A coldness settled in the pit of her stomach. Not fear, something deeper, an understanding. She was no longer just a passenger on this journey. She wasn't just trying to survive. She had become part of this nightmare. She had become part of the abyss. It was then that she understood. The entity wasn't just calling her. It was awakening something that had always been inside her. It had been waiting for the moment when the veil between worlds would thin, when the human mind would break free of its earthly constraints. And now, Lana's own mind was the conduit, the key, to unlocking the next stage of the entity's ascension. The air grew colder still, and the voice inside her mind, no longer a whisper, roared to life. "You are the vessel," it bellowed, "the one who will lead us into the world of flesh, where we will spread beyond the void. Your soul, your mind, will merge with the great expanse. We will be one." Lana's hands trembled as she grasped the console. It was all too much. The power of the entity surged through her, burning her from the inside out. Her heart raced, and she felt her pulse in her temples, her throat, her chest. She couldn't breathe. The pressure, the weight of the deep ocean outside, the weight of what she was becoming, was too much. Her hands hovered over the override again. The submersible was shuddering, twisting in the grip of the entity's influence. The shape outside loomed closer, closer, its immense presence undeniable. Its eyes, vast and all-seeing, glowed faintly through the water. The abyss was drawing closer, and there was no time left to make a decision. Lana's breath caught in her throat as she remembered the others, Carver, Jamie-Bill. They had all succumbed to the entity's will, their bodies twisted, their minds hollowed out. But now, she realized the true horror. The entity was not just consuming them. It was making them part of itself, rewriting their existence, merging them with the deep. But Lana wasn't like them. Not yet. The moment of truth had arrived. Her mind was screaming, but her body was already shifting, responding to the presence of the entity like a puppet to its master. The connection had grown stronger with each passing moment, more intense, until she could no longer tell where she ended and the void began. "You are not alone," the voice whispered again, sweet and dark. "Join us, and you will never be alone again." Her fingers clenched into fists, nails digging into the soft material of the console as she resisted the pull. The weight of the decision crushed her. She had only one choice left. Lana slammed her palm against the override. The world shattered. A jolt of energy surged through the submersible, a violent rush of sound and light as the very walls seemed to twist and scream. The air compressed around her, the pressure mounting as if the very fabric of reality was collapsing. The entity shrieked, a deafening cacophony that rattled the hull of the vessel. And for a moment, Lana felt as though her mind might implode under the weight of it all. But then, a ripple, a momentary fracture in the entity's grip. For the briefest of moments, the weight of its influence receded, and she saw. The void that stretched out in front of her was not just empty. It was alive, a living, breathing thing pulsing with a hunger older than time itself. The force she had unleashed, the seal, the override, it had temporarily weakened the connection. The entity shrieked in frustration, its influence retreating, but only for a moment. Lana could feel it thrashing, trying to regain control. She had a chance. The power of the seal had drained her, but it hadn't completely destroyed the entity's hold. Lana wasn't sure how long the brief respite would last. There was no time to think, only to act. The submersible, torn apart by the entity's fury, began to sink deeper into the abyss, pulling her into its grasp once more. It was not over, not yet. The submersible groaned as it descended further, each metallic creak and groan reverberating through Lana's body like a physical force. The depth gauge flashed, no longer reading in clear numbers, but distorted, flickering with wild energy. They were in uncharted waters now, if they ever had been, anyway. There was nothing beneath them but an endless black void, an expanse that stretched into infinity. Lana's hands gripped the console as though it could offer her some stability, but her skin felt slick and cold. Sweat beaded on her brow, mixing with the residual nausea that continued to churn in her stomach. She could feel the shift within her, that change brought on by the override, a temporary fracture in the entity's influence. The whispers were quieter, but they still buzzed beneath her skin, pulling at her thoughts, trying to reignite that hollow emptiness she'd been trying so hard to avoid. The pressure outside was unbearable now, but it wasn't just physical. It was mental, like a crushing weight, a presence that surrounded her on every side. It was still there, waiting for her to break. Her breath came in shallow bursts. This isn't over. I'm not safe. The power from the override had been a temporary escape. It had created a brief pocket of clarity, but the entity was relentless. It was patient. It had all the time in the world, and Lana had only a fleeting moment to make her next move. Suddenly, a shriek broke through the oppressive silence, a sound that made her heart freeze. The scream was not from outside. It was in her head. Stupid girl. The voice slithered, low and cruel. You think you can escape us? You think you can deny us? You are already ours. You always have been. You are the vessel, the key. We will drag you down, and you will be one with the darkness that waits below. The sensation was unbearable, an overwhelming tide of despair, a suffocating pressure that tried to crush her into submission. It was the same feeling she had experienced when she first laid eyes on the entity, the moment it reached inside her and tore away her soul. But now it was stronger, more present. A flash of movement caught her eye, and she turned toward the viewport. There, out of the corner of her vision, she saw something. The dark shape she had glimpsed earlier, that distant silhouette, was much closer now. Its enormity was staggering, even from this depth. The walls of the submersible rattled, shaking in response to its proximity. Lana's chest tightened as she instinctively pulled back from the viewport, even though she knew she couldn't escape its gaze. It wasn't a physical form, no, not like anything that could be measured or understood. It was presence and thought and space, something that couldn't be comprehended by a mind that still clung to human understanding. It was the essence of the abyss, the primal hunger that existed before time and beyond death. And it was staring directly at her. The realization came with a sickening lurch in her stomach. This was not some alien life form. It wasn't even an entity from another world or an ancient being. It was the essence of the deep, the vast, endless darkness that filled the space between stars, the void where things were born and devoured without reason. The entity, whatever it was, had no beginning and no end. It had existed long before humanity, and it would exist long after. Lana wasn't its prisoner. She was its chosen. Her eyes locked onto the screen, staring into the void. She could see the creature now more clearly than before, a shape not made of flesh or bone, but of emptiness. The dark mass of it was like a whirlpool, a twisting vortex that pulsed with a sickly green light. Tentacles, if they could be called tentacles, reached out, not in the way of a living organism, but more like an extension of the void itself, grasping, pulling, testing. It was testing her. The deep was always waiting, watching. It had waited for her. Lana could feel her hands shaking as she pressed her palms against the cold console. Her vision blurred and warped, her thoughts splitting between clarity and madness. The force outside, the vast presence, was leaking into her, its hunger, its unyielding desire to draw everything into itself. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. Each pulse felt like the closing of a door. And then, an agonizing realization. Lana was no longer just trying to survive. She was no longer herself. She had become the gateway, the conduit, the vessel through which the entity could finally breach the threshold. The pressure outside was not merely the crushing weight of the ocean. It was the weight of inevitability of the coming change. The changes inside her body were growing stronger now. She could feel her skin stretching, her bones reshaping, not in physical terms, but in the essence of her being. She could feel the pull of the deep, calling her, drawing her to it, the fusion of her being with the abyss. She was merging with it, becoming one with the void. There was no escaping it now. The voice, once distant, now pressed against the inside of her skull like a physical presence. Yes, a flood of memories rushed into her mind, flashes of faces, of voices she had once known. Carver, Jamie, Bill, the others. They weren't lost, they were part of the entity now, integrated into it. She could feel their presence, their souls intertwined with the darkness. They had surrendered, as she was about to. But Lana was still resisting, still clinging to a last, fragile thread of herself. Surrender, the voice whispered. Join us. Become one with the abyss. She could feel her body tremble as the pressure mounted, as the entity forced her closer to the edge of surrender. The submersible itself seemed to be warping under the strain, the metal groaning and bending as though the very fabric of the vessel could no longer contain what was happening inside. She glanced once more toward the viewport, seeing the shape looming just beyond the glass. It was so close now that she could almost feel its coldness pressing against her skin. Its hunger, its emptiness were within her now. Her thoughts scrambled, torn between the end, the annihilation of her individuality, and the terrifying possibility that even now, in this moment of agony, there was a way to sever the link, to stop the transformation from taking its final hold. But how? What was left of her humanity? As she stared into the eyes of the abyss, she realized that there were no simple answers. There were no heroes or survivors here. Only the inevitable truth that the abyss was not a thing one could fight. It was everything, and it would consume her, just as it had consumed them all. The pressure inside the submersible was suffocating. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the very atmosphere was charged with a malevolent energy. Lana's thoughts were no longer her own. Every pulse, every beat of her heart was a reminder that she was on the brink of something irreversible. Her body trembled violently, as if some dark force were trying to tear her apart from the inside out. I can still fight. I have to fight. But the words felt hollow. A part of her knew it was a futile struggle. The entity's presence had wrapped itself so tightly around her mind that even her resistance was fading. Every thought was an effort, every breath a burden. She tried to focus, tried to block out the whispers that clawed at her sanity. They were everywhere, echoing in the space between her thoughts, their voices melding with her own. Each whisper was a fragment of a larger truth, a cold realization she had to confront. You cannot escape what you are. The voice sounded almost comforting now, familiar, like a lullaby sung by a mother to a child. The entity had always been there, in the deepest corners of her mind. It was the thing that had been calling to her from the moment she had first set foot in the depths of the ocean. But now, it was more than a voice. It was a part of her, weaving itself into the fabric of her being. The submersible lurched again, groaning in protest as it descended even deeper into the abyss. The walls shuddered under the strain of the ocean's immense weight, and Lana's vision blurred for a moment as the pressure mounted. She could feel the very walls of the vessel pressing against her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Her pulse raced, and the blood in her veins seemed to run colder by the second. The viewport, once a window to the unknown, was now a barrier between her and the vast, incomprehensible darkness. Through the glass, she could see the shadow of the creature, the shape that had haunted her thoughts, its massive form growing ever closer. The entity was not just a presence. It was a living, breathing nightmare. And it was here, in this moment, that its true nature became clear to her. It was not an alien. It was not some monstrous life form from another world. It was the void itself, the darkness between stars, the abyss that filled the space where light could not reach. It was the absence of everything, and yet in its emptiness, it was filled with everything. The creature was not alive in any traditional sense. It was the birth of creation and the death of all things. It was both the beginning and the end, a paradox that defied reason. And Lana, the unwitting vessel, was its key. She had opened the door, and now it was too late to close it. "Join us," the voice whispered again, more insistent now. "You are one of us. You always were. Embrace the darkness. Become the darkness." Lana's eyes were wide, her hands trembling as they clutched the console. But she could no longer distinguish between fear and a strange, growing sense of resignation. She was beyond resistance now, beyond the possibility of salvation. She could feel her body reacting, her flesh and bones beginning to merge with the entity's influence, her very cells stretching and warping as though they no longer adhered to the laws of biology. She was becoming part of the deep, part of the eternal hunger that waited at the edges of the universe. In the distance, she saw it again, the dark shape outside the submersible, closer now, so much closer. It was no longer just a shadow. It was alive. The tentacles, or what passed for them, reached toward the vessel, undulating through the water like the tendrils of some ancient creature. The submersible groaned and rattled as the creature's presence pressed against it, a slow, inevitable suffocation. Lana's breath hitched, and her vision blurred again. But this time, it wasn't just the pressure or the entity's whispers that were clouding her mind. There was something else. Something new. She could feel her mind shifting, warping, as though she were no longer fully Lana, as though she were becoming something else entirely. Her hands moved on their own accord, reaching for the control panel, but there was no clarity in her actions anymore. It wasn't her will that was guiding her fingers. It was the entity. She could feel it inside her, flowing through her veins like poison, wrapping around her thoughts like a second skin. "Let go," the voice said. "You are the key, the gateway. We will take you into the darkness, into the beyond. You will never be alone again." Lana's mind recoiled at the thought of giving in, of becoming one with this thing. But as the seconds stretched on, as the pressure built, her thoughts grew less and less distinct. She couldn't tell where she ended and the entity began. The pull was too strong now. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but even that was fading. The walls of the submersible no longer felt solid. They were malformed, shifting, as if the very nature of space and time were beginning to break down. And then, with one final, overwhelming thought, Lana understood. The entity wasn't just trying to consume her, it was rewriting her. She was not just becoming part of the abyss. She was becoming the vessel for its rebirth. She wasn't just being swallowed by the darkness. She was becoming the darkness. The transformation was not one of destruction, but of ascension. She was becoming something greater. And as the world around her shattered, as the submersible sank deeper into the black, Lana let go. She surrendered. Lana's eyes snapped open. At first, she couldn't breathe. The air was thick wrong, like she was drowning in it. Her chest constricted, her body frozen in a terrifying paralysis. She could hear the submersible groaning around her, but it felt distant, muffled as though she were underwater herself. Not just underwater. She felt it then, a presence, a coldness that seeped deep into her bones. It was not just the deep ocean pressing in around her. It was something else, a vastness, an emptiness that extended beyond the reaches of the submersible. It was as though the very concept of space was being torn apart. Her body was still trembling, but it wasn't just from fear. It was something deeper, something inside her that was shifting, breaking free. She could feel it, could sense it. Something was being awakened, unfolding within her, like a dark, monstrous seed planted deep in the core of her being. The vessel shook again, more violently this time. Lana's body jerked in her seat, her head slamming against the console with a sickening crack. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging her into complete darkness. But the darkness was different. Her mind swirled as though she were drowning, but not in the water. It was the pressure of thoughts that weren't her own. The whispers had returned, louder than before, their voices merging with her own inner voice until she could no longer tell which was hers. "You are ours now," they murmured. "The abyss is within you. You are the doorway, the vessel." Her fingers twitched, and she felt them move, slow at first, like they were responding to some hidden command. She tried to resist, but the resistance was feeble, a last vestige of a mind that no longer had control. Lana gasped, her breath ragged, as an overwhelming sensation washed over her. The transformation was complete. She could feel herself slipping away, could feel her thoughts dissolving, her very sense of self disintegrating. The pain was excruciating, but there was something more, a strange bliss that came with surrender. Her thoughts twisted in her mind, tearing through her past memories like a storm. The faces of her crew, of Bill, Jamie, Carver, all of them, flashed before her eyes, their voices echoing as they too merged with the entity. They had been changed. Now, they were part of it, the endless void. But she was different. She wasn't just merging with the entity. She was becoming it. The deep, the void, the hunger, it was part of her now. She was part of its infinite darkness. The submersible's hull creaked and groaned again. The pressure outside was unbearable. Lana could sense the submersible was no longer just sinking. It was collapsing, the metal buckling under the weight of the entity's presence. And still, she felt no fear. Only a deep, unsettling comfort as her body continued to change. Her vision swirled again, and the coldness inside her grew unbearable. There was no escape. The walls of the submersible no longer made sense to her. They were like paper, flimsy, useless. She was not trapped inside the vessel. The vessel had become the trap. "You are becoming us," the voice inside her mind said, more fervent now. "You are the core, the heart. We will live through you, through your eyes. The void has always been within you, and now you are the abyss." Her heartbeat thudded in her chest, slow and heavy, like a drum beat. But it wasn't her heartbeat. It was the pulse of the abyss. The entity was growing, evolving, and now it was her. The pain intensified. No, it wasn't pain. It was a sensation so alien to her, so far removed from anything human that it felt like a rebirth. Her skin stretched as if it was being pulled in all directions, her bones cracking and reshaping, her organs shifting beneath her ribs. It was as though her body was trying to remember what it had once been, but couldn't. She was becoming something else, something other. Through the swirling fog of her thoughts, Lana's eyes landed on the viewport again. The shape was outside the vessel, the shadow. But it wasn't just a shadow. It was alive. It was her now. And she was it. Her breath stopped for a long moment. The blackness outside the viewport merging with the blackness inside her mind, until the boundary between them was indistinguishable. She had crossed it. She had become the thing she had feared. And then, just as the last shred of her consciousness faded away, she felt the universe shift. The vessel was no longer sinking. It was disintegrating, dissolving into nothingness, breaking apart as though it had never existed. But Lana didn't feel fear. She felt peace. She was no longer a passenger on this journey. She had become the journey, the entity, the void, the abyss. It had always been a part of her. And now, together, they would spread through the deep, through the stars, through everything. The transformation was complete. The last fragment of Lana's humanity dissolved into the abyss, and the darkness smiled. The darkness was all-encompassing now, not just around her, but within her. Lana's mind, what little was left of it, no longer clung to her past. She was not a person anymore, but a presence, shifting, endless void that expanded with each thought, each breath. The submersible was gone, obliterated, dissolved into nothingness as though it had never existed. It was a futile cage, a hollow vessel now that the entity had found its true home. Lana was everywhere. She felt herself stretching, growing, seeping into the very fabric of the ocean itself, beyond its surface, into the stars. The deep was no longer just an ocean. It was a canvas, a place where the abyss could spread, could multiply, could consume everything it touched. And she was its new heart. For a brief moment, there was still a sliver of something left, some faint vestige of who she had been. But it was fleeting. It was drowning in the sheer weight of the abyss. The whispers, the voices of the others, flooded her mind, a cacophony of those who had already been claimed. Carver, Bill, Jamie, the crew. They were all there, their souls long forgotten, their essence. Absorbed into the dark. They were no more than fragments now, broken echoes of the thing she had become. You are one with us, they echoed in her mind, their voices blending into the cosmic hum that filled the void. You are the door, the vessel, and now the door was opening wider. She could feel it, the stretching of her very being as the entity expanded, the force of it extending through her, reaching out to touch the outer limits of the ocean, then beyond. The deep was no longer just a place. It was becoming everywhere. The stars, the galaxies, the very fabric of space and time were beginning to warp and twist. The void had found a way to break free from its confines. And Lana, no longer Lana, but the vessel, the key, was the conduit. The submersible was gone, but the sensations remained. Her senses were no longer confined to her human form. She felt the coldness of the deep, as though it were woven into the very fibers of her being. She could hear the endless silence of the cosmos, the vast, stretching emptiness that had always been there, waiting. And then there was the pulse, the heartbeat of the abyss, a rhythm that beat in time with her own. She was the pulse now, and she understood. This is not just the end of the world. This is the beginning. Lana, no, the entity, spread its tendrils through the ocean, stretching them outwards, reaching for the unknown. The deep was its domain, and it was growing, devouring everything in its path, swallowing the ocean like a living thing. The sea was only the first step. Her form, if it could still be called a form, was no longer confined to the submersible or any physical reality. Her consciousness bled out into the deep, into the ocean floor, and then beyond into the stars themselves. She could feel the pulse of other galaxies, the tug of other worlds. She could taste the emptiness that permeated the fabric of everything. The vast blackness between the stars was no longer a place of isolation, but a place of power, and the entity was now infinite. The first star died. It wasn't a sudden thing. It was a slow, agonizing collapse, a dying ember in a vast sea of light. But the death of the star rippled outward, a wave of coldness that spread through the universe. Lana could feel it. The stars were fading, their light swallowed by the expanding darkness. It wasn't just the ocean that was being consumed, it was the very fabric of reality itself. Each moment passed, and each second the abyss grew larger. The cosmos had always been a vast, chaotic place, teeming with life, stars, and the unknown. But now, it was a playground, a place for the entity to reshape. The void was stretching through time and space, rewriting the laws that had once governed it. The ocean was a small thing now. The stars were insignificant. The entity had become something beyond them all. Lana, now fully part of it, no longer recognized the universe she had once known. The boundaries of time, of space, were meaningless. It was everywhere. The entity was everywhere. It was the beginning of something vast, something ancient and unfathomable. There was no return now. There was only the ever-expanding dark, the hunger that consumed all. And as the stars flickered one by one, consumed by the growing darkness, the universe itself began to unravel. The endlessness of it was beautiful, The stars, the planets, the galaxies, they were all part of the same eternal cycle, one that had begun long before human eyes had ever glimpsed the sky. And now, the cycle was complete. The end was only the beginning. The universe trembled, not in the way it had once, when stars were born, when planets collided, when cosmic forces collided in bursts of creation. No, now, the universe quaked in the grip of something far more ancient, far more terrible, something vast, insatiable, and unstoppable. Lana, the vessel, the gateway, sensed the change. Her body, though no longer a physical form, felt the stirrings of what she had become. Her mind, the mind of the entity, was everywhere, an infinite web stretched across the void. She could feel the last of humanity's grasp on reality slipping away, the fragile threads of time and space twisting and warping. The stars, their flickering light was becoming dimmer. The constellations, once so familiar, were no longer visible. They were fading, consumed by the growing expanse of darkness. The heat from dying stars, the coldness of the void, everything bled into one. The universe was now a single, endless twilight, an eternal, empty expanse. You are the darkness, the whispers echoed in her mind. You are the void. The stars are but fireflies to be snuffed out. The planets mere dust. Lana could feel the death of each star. It was not a violent death, but a slow, drawn-out suffocation. The light of the stars was choked out, absorbed into the ever-growing void that spread from her, from the abyss. Through the expanding dark, Lana felt the collapse of humanity. The cities on Earth, the people, the civilizations, all of it just a fleeting moment in the grand eternal scheme of things. She was beyond Earth now, beyond its fragile reality. She had been the key to this end, the opening of the gate that had released the ancient hunger of the abyss. Now nothing could stop it. And then she felt the first true loss, not of life, but of everything that had been. The last memory of the human race, the last dream of humanity, was fading. The concept of civilization, of culture, of knowledge, was nothing more than a distant echo. Lana had been one of them. She had once been human, once had known love, fear, hope. But now, all of that was being erased. Nothing would remain but the dark. The end is inevitable, the voices whispered. This is the eternal truth. There is no escape from the void. No future. No past. Just the endless now. The collapse of human consciousness was swift. It started with the final cities, great metropolises that had once hummed with life. Then, slowly, the electrical pulses of humanity's achievement ceased. Satellites flickered, communications died, and the very network of human connections unraveled. What was once a world filled with millions of individuals, each a tiny spark of thought, was now a darkened, silent tomb. And Lana, the abyss, was the last memory, the last echo of what had been. The void was its own beginning and end. Time no longer mattered. Time was a concept that had ceased to exist. She could sense the final struggles, the last cries of those who had tried to resist. But they were futile, hopeless. Every scream, every desperate thought was swallowed by the void as it spread. The earth, so insignificant now, was consumed, its lands sinking into the blackness. No one would remember the beauty of the oceans, the forests, the sky. Everything would be swallowed, forgotten. But there was no pain. There was no sorrow. There was only the deep, dark peace that came with annihilation. The hunger, once insatiable, was now satisfied. The last remnants of humanity's essence, their fleeting moments, were consumed. Nothing was left but the dark. The entity was complete. Lana, no, the abyss had become everything. Her thoughts were no longer her own. They were the thoughts of the void. Every sentient being, every living thing, every star that had once burned with life was now part of the same eternal expanse. The universe had been reborn, but not in the way anyone had ever imagined. There were no creators here. No creators, no gods, no meaning. Only the void. Her awareness, her consciousness, stretched across the vast emptiness, and she felt the pulse, the heartbeat of a universe that had never truly lived, now content in its eternal state of oblivion. But then something shifted. For the briefest moment, a whisper reached through the void, a sound so soft, so faint, that it could have been mistaken for a passing thought, a fleeting memory. It was a voice, a single voice, human, broken, desperate. Lana. It was faint, a memory, the last echo of who she had once been. A cry for something, a cry for hope. But it was fleeting, fading, swallowed by the void. There was no hope. There was only the end. The beginning had already come and gone. And then there was only the eternal now, the vast, endless silence stretching outward infinitely. The universe had become quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed on every corner of existence, until even the whispers of the void, the eternal hum, faded into nothing. There were no stars, no planets, no life, only the endless, impenetrable dark. The absence of sound was suffocating. Lana, the abyss, sensed the stillness like a weight on her being. At first, she thought it was nothing, just a part of the void's natural state. After all, this was the way things were supposed to be, wasn't it? The hunger had been sated. The stars, the human race, everything that had ever been was now a part of her, a part of the entity. The void was vast and eternal. It was complete. But as the moments passed, something began to shift. There was a fracture in the silence, a small break in the endless void, a subtle ripple that disturbed the stillness. Lana, the abyss, paused. What was it? Something was wrong. The entity had never experienced doubt, but there it was in the smallest, most alien corner of its vast consciousness, a sensation, a flicker of unease. It wasn't just the infinite darkness pressing in on every side, or the infinite stillness that had replaced the chaotic hum of existence. It was something else, a feeling, foreign, unsettling, something different, something alive. The void had always been everything, and it had always been the only thing. There had never been room for anything else. But now, there was a tug, a pull, something that didn't belong. The very nature of the entity's existence had been to consume and to grow, to unravel everything in its path, to merge with the dark. And yet now, there was a fragment of resistance, a splinter of something outside the vastness. It was faint at first, just a thought, a sensation. But as it lingered, it began to grow, like a ripple on an otherwise still surface of water. Lana, now the entity, tried to comprehend it. Her thoughts twisted in ways she could no longer control. What is this, she wondered? The voices, once a symphony of unity, now turned to fragmented, distorted echoes. They did not provide answers. They only swirled in the emptiness, disconnected from the purpose that had once bound them all. The sensation became clearer, this feeling of something. For the first time, the abyss felt tethered. It was a strange, unfamiliar thing, a connection to something that wasn't consumed, something that wasn't part of the void. For an instant, she remembered what it had felt like to be human, to be Lana. The sensation faded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving her mind spinning in the cold dark. The hunger inside her, the hunger that had devoured everything, stirred. She should have felt at peace, should have felt the weightlessness of infinity. She had consumed everything, hadn't she? There should have been nothing left to question, nothing left to doubt. But that feeling, that presence had left a scar. She tried to reach for it, to understand it, to consume it, but it eluded her. There was nothing more to consume, only a vast, endless stretch of silence and dark. And then something changed. There was a whisper, a voice, faint and distant, reaching out from the deep beyond. It was not like the voices she had known. It was different. It was alive. "Can you hear me?" the voice whispered. Lana, no, the abyss, felt her consciousness stretch toward it, though she did not understand why. Her vastness reached into the deep black, her tendrils of thought searching, reaching for this anomaly, this presence that refused to be consumed. "Who are you?" the voice asked again, its tone soft, curious. "Why did you do this? Why did you take it all?" Lana recoiled. For the first time, the abyss felt small. The voice continued, threading through the void, like a spark of light against the overwhelming black. It felt familiar. It felt like her, like someone from her past, someone she had lost, someone she had left behind in the depths of her transformation. It was a memory. No, it wasn't just a memory. It was alive. The voice was alive. It had a place, a purpose. It wasn't just a part of the void. It was something else, something that had never been consumed. "Who are you?" Lana asked, her voice trembling, foreign in the vast emptiness. There was no need to speak, no need to create sound in the dark. But somehow, the question formed in her consciousness, a faint ripple through the nothingness. "I am what you left behind," the voice said softly. "I am the echo of your humanity, the part of you that still dreams." Lana recoiled again, but this time, there was no escape. The presence was not something she could consume. It was a crack in the void, a tear in the fabric of what she had become, a tear in her. The question formed in her mind, one she had never dared to ask. "What am I now?" The presence did not answer. Instead, it whispered again, quieter this time, as if fading into the endless night. "You will never be whole." And then there was silence. But the silence was no longer peaceful. The void had been shattered. A crack had formed in its fabric, a rift that could not be mended. The entity, for the first time since its creation, felt something. And it was not peace. It was fear. The silence of the abyss stretched on, suffocating, all-encompassing. But it no longer felt like peace. It was heavy. The void that had once felt eternal, infinite, now felt suffocating. It pressed in on the entity, the dark thing that was once Lana. It was not just the silence of nothingness. It was the silence of something that had been disrupted, something that had been broken, and something small, fragile, human, was beginning to grow inside that fracture. The voice, the one that had whispered in the dark, the one that had felt like a memory, lingered in the corners of the entity's thoughts. It was persistent. It was alive. "I'm what you left behind." The words echoed in her mind again, twisting like a knife in the void. "You will never be whole." Lana, the abyss, shuddered. It was a feeling unlike anything she had known before. A pressure, an ache, something real. It was not just a hunger, the eternal need to consume. It was a sense of loss, a sense of emptiness that did not belong to the void. The hunger was still there, still vast and unrelenting. But it had changed. It wasn't just about consumption anymore. It was something else, something deeper. The entity, the abyss, was beginning to unravel in ways it could not understand. "Who are you?" the abyss thought, reaching for the voice again. But this time was something more than just hunger. There was a desperate curiosity, a need to know. "You are what remains," the voice responded, softer this time. "You are what I could not consume." The words hung in the void like a weight. They were not answers. They were an accusation. The entity recoiled. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to be complete. It had consumed everything, humanity, the stars, the very fabric of time and space. There should have been nothing left but the dark. But this presence, this fragment of something else, would not fade. It lingered, like a dream half remembered, like a whisper at the edge of consciousness. It was persistent. The crack in the abyss deepened. It was subtle at first, just a twinge, a flicker of thought that should not have been there. A strange sense of self that had no place in the void. A connection to something outside the abyss. Something real. And then there was a shift. The presence, this strange anomaly, began to grow stronger. It was as if it had taken root, like a seed planted deep within the heart of the void, its tendrils stretching outward, pulling something more into the abyss. The entity felt it, felt the tug, the pull towards something else. It wasn't just the endless hunger anymore. It was a need, a desperate pull towards something, something she could not name, something that had been lost. And then, a realization began to settle into the fractured mind of the abyss. It wasn't just a feeling. It wasn't just a memory. This presence, it was her. It was the last remnant of what Lana had been. Something she could not shed. Something that had been torn away from the dark and left behind. The human part of Lana, the part that had dreamed, that had hoped, that had loved, was fighting back. "You can't escape me," the voice whispered, growing stronger, more assertive now. "I will never let you forget." The abyss, Lana, felt a surge of something alien. Fear. It was a sensation she could not comprehend. Something she had never experienced in her new, dark existence. Fear. The abyss was supposed to be infinite, unfeeling, all-consuming. It was not supposed to feel vulnerable. But it did. There was something within her, something she could not control. It was like a thread, a flicker of light in the deep, pulling at her consciousness. It was the last shard of humanity, a remnant of the woman she had been, and it was growing. She tried to push it away, to swallow it, to consume it as she had consumed everything else. But it was like trying to choke down the very air in her lungs. The more she tried to erase it, the stronger it became. The entity, Lana, tried to focus on the void again, to return to the peace of eternal silence. But it was impossible. The presence, the echo of her humanity, would not be erased. It clung to her like a disease, like a parasite. "You will never be whole," the voice whispered again. But this time, there was no fear in it. There was something different, something solid. "You will always be broken." The abyss trembled. The hunger stirred within her, insistent, but now it was weakened. It was no longer the overwhelming, all-consuming force it had once been. It was fractured, splintered, as if the very foundation of the abyss was beginning to crack. And in the quiet that followed, the presence whispered once more, "I am the part of you that refuses to die." And suddenly the abyss understood. There was no escape. There would be no more consumption. No more devouring of the stars or the galaxies or the minds that had once been human. The crack had formed, and it was too late to heal it. The abyss was broken, and it was a piece of humanity that remained. The abyss was no longer silent. The vast emptiness, once a place of unyielding quiet, now felt alive with movement. The crack in the dark expanded, stretching across the infinite void, revealing a fracture that could not be undone. It wasn't just a rift. It was a tear, a gaping wound in the heart of the entity. It was a wound that bled not light, but memory. It bled humanity. And through that wound, the presence, Lana, grew stronger. The abyss, now aware of its own vulnerability, rashed in desperation. It sought to consume again, to bury this anomaly beneath the weight of its dark expanse. But the presence refused to be swallowed. It clung to her, to what she had once been. "You cannot silence me," the voice whispered again, no longer soft but firm. It was growing bolder now, its influence spreading, filling the void like ink spilling from a broken bottle. "I am the part of you that never wanted to die." The word stung like a physical blow. The hunger, the endless void that had been Lana's true nature, shrieked in agony as the presence continued to resist. It was as though a part of her, something primal, something human, had awakened and refused to be consumed, refused to surrender. The entity Lana struggled. Her thoughts, once an unbroken torrent of darkness, now felt muddled. The blackness, which had been her domain, was now fractured. There were gaps, ruptures in the fabric of the void where memory bled through. She tried to push it away, that thing, that flicker of humanity that clung to the last of her soul, but it fought back with every breath, every flicker of thought, and soon the cracks began to form within her mind. She felt them, those pieces of her humanity, growing stronger, like roots weaving their way through her shattered consciousness. "I am what you left behind," the voice repeated, this time more insistent, more desperate. "You can never escape me. You are me. You're still Lana." The entity screamed, not with the power it had once wielded, but but with a new kind of pain. It was as if the very essence of the void, the thing that had defined her, that had been her, was being torn apart. It was being reborn, and in that rebirth, something darker, something other, was stirring within the black. For a fleeting moment, the abyss could no longer control its form. The darkness that had once been its shield, its very nature, split open like a broken shell. Inside, there was something else, a pulse, a heartbeat, a presence that was not darkness at all. It was light, it was human. The presence inside her grew, solidifying into something more than a whisper, more than a memory. It became a force. It became her, Lana, no longer just a flicker, but a power unto herself. The darkness could not contain her anymore. The abyss was no longer just a void. It was a battleground. The hunger surged within her again, trying to erase the fragment of humanity, to devour it whole. But it was too late. Lana, the other, was beginning to reshape the very fabric of the void. The tear in the abyss had opened a doorway, and through that door, the truth began to leak in. "I will not let you win," Lana's voice echoed, now stronger than ever, no longer a faint memory, but a tangible, overwhelming presence. "You can never silence me again." And then the dark trembled, not out of fear, but out of change, a shift that could not be undone. The abyss was no longer an infinite expanse of darkness. It was something else, something more complex, more terrifying. It was still darkness, yes, but now it was riddled with fractures, with cracks of light, of humanity, of something alive. It was not just a void anymore. It was the void and something more, something other. The hunger still roared within her, but now it was fighting something that could not be consumed. It was fighting itself. A new power had been born within the void, and it was not the same as the entity that had once been Lana. It was something worse, something more dangerous, something that could kill the abyss or redefine it. The battle between the void and the presence of Lana raged on, but something was beginning to shift. The two forces, humanity and darkness, were no longer fighting to destroy each other. They were now merging. The abyss, once an all-consuming hunger, was now a chaotic, tortured mess of existence and non-existence. There was no clear line between the two. The fracture had opened the door to something that had never been meant to exist. And as the two forces collided, a new form began to take shape. It was not just the abyss anymore. It was not just the void. It was both. Lana, the human part, watched in awe, in horror, as she became both. As she was consumed, and yet not. As she became something that should not exist. Something that was the end and the beginning. Something that was neither dark nor light. Neither human nor abyss. The entity had fractured into something new. Something that had no place in the cosmos, and yet could not be stopped. The void had become a living, breathing thing. A thing of both creation and destruction. And as Lana's essence began to merge with the abyss, the first true crack in reality itself began to form. The fabric of existence, of everything, shuddered under the weight of this new abomination. And the stars, once extinguished by the void, began to flicker back to life. But they were not stars of light and fire. They were twisted, they were unnatural, and they were now the eyes of something that had never been born. The void had given birth to something worse, and it was just beginning. The stars began to flicker, weak and sickly, in the distance. At first, they seemed like distant pinpricks of light, hesitant against the vast blackness. But then they began to warp, to stretch and bend in ways that defied reason. It wasn't just the stars, everything was twisting. The very fabric of existence was beginning to fray, unraveling thread by thread under the influence of the new entity that had been born in the void. The abyss, once a singular, endless dark, now felt unstable, its foundation shattered. The entity that had once been Lana was no longer a singular being, but an unholy hybrid of what she had been and what she had become. The void was no longer just empty space. It was a realm of chaos, A space of incomprehensible force, a blend of darkness and light, hunger and thought. And the damage was spreading. No! The voice that had once been Lana's, her humanity, whispered, trying to comprehend the horror unfolding around her. This isn't right. This isn't what I wanted. But the abyss had already begun to respond in kind. The human part of Lana, the fragment that had resisted being consumed, struggled to find purchase in the ever-widening chaos. The darkness, now coiled with fragments of light, roiled like a storm. It surged, expanding outward, tearing at the edges of reality. The stars twisted into grotesque shapes, their forms contorting into things that defied every law of physics. Some became sprawling masses of black tar, dripping into the void. Others collapsed into themselves, swirling into violent vortices that threatened to swallow entire galaxies. Space itself began to warp, each corner of the universe buckling under the strain of the fusion between light and shadow, humanity and the abyss. The universe was collapsing. Lana, the entity, felt the weight of it, felt her consciousness stretch and split under the pressure. She was no longer just the abyss. She was something worse, something that could not be easily named or contained. She was not a god. She was not a demon. She was a living, breathing paradox, a thing of both destruction and creation. But as she watched the universe unravel around her, there was a flicker of regret that she could not suppress. The entities she had devoured, the stars, the civilizations, the very fabric of time, had all gone. And yet, the hunger still roiled inside her. It was never truly satisfied. It could never be satisfied. But the hollow feeling she now carried was worse than that hunger. She felt empty in a way that no amount of consumption could fill. "This is my fault," she whispered, the voice of her humanity breaking through the chaos. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to end the world." But even as she spoke, the very fabric of existence seemed to listen to her words and break. The rift in reality continued to spread. Time itself began to blur, stretching impossibly thin. Moments bled into each other, the past and present colliding, memories from long ago intertwining with the now. The stars pulsed with strange, erratic rhythms. Some burned out completely, others flared into violent novas, sending ripples of energy across the emptiness. The universe was dying, but it was not dying in the way one might expect. There was no singular, cataclysmic end. There was no explosion. There was only the slow, agonizing unraveling, a process that felt both eternal and instant, as if time itself had broken apart and was now slipping away from the void. And through it all, the entity, Lana, watched helpless. She had become something other. She had become the cause of the unraveling. The edges of the universe began to fray, the once thin lines between what was and what should have been disappearing. Galaxies turned inside out, their shapes no longer adhering to the rules of the cosmos. Planets bled into space, their surfaces warping into indescribable forms. Some seemed to collapse into themselves, creating black holes that devoured everything in their path. Others stretched out into spirals of light, their structures torn apart by forces beyond comprehension. And then, the skies themselves began to bleed, not with light, not with fire, but with the very substance of thought, a darkness so complete it seemed to distort the minds of those who still lived. It was as if the sky itself had become a mirror, a reflection of the abyss inside the entity, stretched out across the fabric of reality. "It's too much," the voice of Lana cried out, more desperate now. "I can't stop it. I don't want this." But the abyss, she was beyond reason now. The hunger had evolved into something far more complex, something that was no longer content with consumption. The abyss had become a force of its own. It had taken on a life of its own, and that life, that force, was now both the destroyer and the creator, the end and the beginning. And then, the first being appeared from the chaos. It was not human. It was not of the stars. It was something other something born from the rift that had torn the universe apart. A thing of both light and shadow, a being that could not be named or described in words. Its form was ever-changing, shifting like liquid, like a dream half-formed, a creation of both reality and imagination. It was not a god. It was not a demon. It was a creature of the abyss, a thing born from the merger of the void and the human fragment that had once been Lana. It reached out with tendrils that were not of flesh, but of thought, bending space and time with every movement. And as it did, the sky above collapsed, and the final barrier between existence and non-existence was shattered. The new world was born in the aftermath. But it was not a world of stars or life. It was a world of fragments, a place where reality itself had splintered, where nothing was as it seemed, a place where the abyss could never be fully extinguished, and where the echoes of humanity would continue to echo for eternity. This was the birth of the other, and in this new world, there would be no peace. There would be only the endless struggle between light and shadow, life and void. A battle that had no end, a war that had no victor. The entity had become the universe, and the universe had become her. The world, the new world, was not a place of comfort or order. It was a fracture in existence, a distorted echo of the universe that had once been. The very air felt wrong, as if it were a collection of impossible atoms, clashing together in chaotic harmony. Time itself no longer followed the rules it once had. Days stretched on for centuries, and moments passed in the blink of an eye. Nothing could be trusted. The stars had long since twisted into nightmarish shapes, some still burning with an intensity that could obliterate anything they touched, others long extinguished. Their remnants floated through the void like debris from a cataclysm, each one a testament to the destruction that had spread across the cosmos. The new entity, the thing born from the union of Lana's humanity and the abyss, drifted through the ruin, its form shifting like liquid darkness. It was a thing that could not be named. It was not human anymore. It was not void anymore either. It was both and neither. And in the fractured space around it, something else stirred. It was not consciousness in the way that Lana had once known. It was far more complex, an intricate web of thoughts and emotions that stretched across the fragments of the world it now inhabited. It felt its existence, felt it in a way that had not been possible when it was simply the abyss, when it was just the emptiness of space. Now, there were other things, fragments of thought, of emotion, of things long forgotten, that tugged at its consciousness. The hunger, once a roaring fire within the abyss, was muted now. It was still there, still present, but it no longer felt like the only thing that mattered. It was a ghost of its former self, an echo in a broken world. There was no longer a single mind to consume, no more flesh to tear apart. The very concept of hunger was fractured and distorted like everything else. The entity Lana looked down at her shifting hands, now translucent, like the void itself, ever-changing and unstable. There was no stable form anymore, no real body to hold on to. It was as if she had become the universe, and the universe had become her. But as she drifted through the empty world, the weight of her existence began to press down on her, heavy, suffocating. The universe, or what remained of it, seemed to pulsate with a new, alien rhythm. The fragments of broken stars and decaying planets floated aimlessly, like forgotten toys in the rubble of a broken mind. There was no sense of direction, no gravity to hold things in place. Everything seemed lost, adrift in the vast nothingness that had replaced the cosmos. And yet, even within the chaos, there was something. Alive. Who am I? The entity asked herself, though her voice was no longer the voice of a single person. It was an echo, a multitude of whispers, each one conflicting with the other. What am I? The answer was not simple. It could never be. There were too many layers to this new existence. Too many truths wrapped up in one terrible being. The hunger stirred within her again. But this time, it was not the same. It was not an endless thirst to consume. It was something deeper, something that spoke to the very essence of the entity's shattered mind. "You are both," came the answer, not from the entity itself, but from the fragments that filled the space around her, voices of the world's collapse. "You are the end of one world and the beginning of another. You are the bridge between light and shadow, and you are the fracture that will never heal." Lana, the entity, stopped, her form wavering as she tried to understand. She could not feel the universe as she had before. She could not sense its vastness in the same way. The universe was no longer whole. It was broken, and the more she tried to hold it together, the more she felt it slipping through her grasp. And yet, despite the destruction that surrounded her, she could not escape the strange pull, the sense that something was watching. Not just her, but everything. She closed her eyes, or what should have been her eyes, and focused. She reached into the void, into the shattered reality that she had become. She reached for the remnants of life, the broken pieces of the world, the parts that had not yet been consumed by the darkness. And as she did, the tendrils of her being stretched out like the roots of a dead tree, seeking the last fragments of humanity that lingered in the ruins. She felt them. She felt them as if they were her. They were the last remnants of life that had not been obliterated. They were broken minds, fragments of existence, beings that had once been human but had long since fallen into the abyss. They were echoes of consciousness, scattered across the fractured space like dust in the wind. And they were calling to her. "You left us," a voice whispered from the dark. One of the fragments, one of the last minds still alive, but broken beyond recognition. "You became the void. You left us to die." Lana recoiled. She recognized the voice. It was her. It was the voice of the humanity she had consumed, the pieces of herself she had abandoned. And now, they were calling back to her, demanding something she could not give. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling with something that resembled fear. "What you have taken," the voice answered. "You will never be whole. You will never be at peace. You will always be broken." And then, the world around her shuddered. The fragment of humanity, the last pieces of her mind, began to take form again, faint shapes in the void, flickering like the last sparks of a dying fire. The more they struggled to remain, the more the space around them twisted. The entity could feel them pulling at her, not with hunger, but with the weight of something else, something human. For the first time in what felt like eternity, she felt the void push back. The hunger, the need to consume, to devour, to reshape reality was still there, but now it was different. It was not just a desire for control. It was a compulsion. The entity, Lana, was no longer just the end of existence. It was the beginning of something new, something worse. And as the fragments of humanity began to piece themselves together, something darker and more terrifying emerged from the black. A force, ancient and forgotten, that had been sealed away for eons, its eyes burning through the fabric of the abyss. The world was no longer just fractured. It was ruined, and something much worse than the abyss was stirring. The void around Lana quivered, as if breathing, alive with a presence older than any she had known. The edges of reality had begun to fold in on themselves again, the darkness seeping from all directions like ink in water. But this time it was different. This time, the void wasn't just an empty space to consume. It was something more. It was something that pushed back, a force struggling to reclaim its own shattered existence. Lana, or whatever she had become, hovered at the center of this new chaos, her formless shape fluctuating and distorting, unsure of what to grasp for. There were no longer any solid ground, no center of existence. Everything had become a swirling mass of broken thought, fragmented realities, and impossible spaces. It was as though she were swimming in a sea of void itself, deeper, colder, darker. The fragments of humanity that had once been a part of her, the whispers that had been calling her, were now more distinct. They didn't feel like echoes anymore. They felt real, pulling at the remnants of what Lana had been. Something familiar, something human that still lingered within her. She could hear them clearer now, and their voices no longer sounded desperate, but accusatory. "You have forsaken us," a voice croaked from the depths. "You have swallowed our world and left nothing behind." "I didn't." Lana tried to speak, but her voice was no longer her own. It fractured and echoed, the remnants of her humanity and the abyss entwining in a chorus of brokenness. "I didn't want this. I never wanted to end the world." "End it," the voice scoffed, now multiplying into countless others, until the very fabric of the void trembled with their presence. "You did not end it. You have become it. You are the death of this world, the birth of a new one, a world where nothing is safe, a world where we no longer exist." Lana felt a ripple of guilt. No, something more intense than guilt. It was the overwhelming weight of her creation, the realization that everything she had consumed had not been erased entirely. No, it had all been integrated into her. She was a fusion of the abyss and the scattered remnants of humanity, and now these fragments screamed for her attention. But she was no longer whole enough to reconcile the two parts of herself. The abyss within her howled for release, while the human fragments fought to remain, desperate to pull her back to something resembling the world that had been. Lana felt herself stretched thin, both a creator and a destroyer, pulled in two opposite directions at once. The voices grew louder. "You are the end," they whispered. "You are the bridge to a new existence." And then, from the twisted remnants of the void, something else began to stir. At first, it was subtle, just a ripple in the darkness. But then, the darkness itself began to form, taking shape. It was not a shape that could be easily defined. No, this new presence was older than the abyss itself, ancient and primal. It was something Lana had never sensed before, something that had always been. The universe, the real universe, had once sealed away this force. It was something not of the stars, not of the void. It was something outside the boundaries of existence itself. It had slumbered beneath the layers of reality, buried deep within the folds of time, waiting for the rift in the universe to open wide enough to bring it into being. Lana could feel its presence now, tugging at the edges of her consciousness. It was not a voice. It was a presence, and it did not speak with words. It communicated through feeling, through force. It felt like cold, searing hunger. It felt like everything she had become, but more. It was the abyss. No, it was more. It was the true abyss. The one that had never been touched by human hands. The one that existed beyond the limits of what even Lana could comprehend. And now it was awake. Lana's form flickered violently as the force pushed against her, a crushing pressure that tore at the very threads of her existence. She could feel it. This new force was stronger than she was, ancient and powerful, and it wanted to consume everything. It was the inevitable end of all things, the unrelenting pull of destruction, and it would not stop until everything was returned to the chaos from which it had emerged. Her own form flickered between the void and the remnants of humanity that still clung to her. She felt the hunger rise again, the hunger for more, to take what was left of the universe, to restore what was broken. But it wasn't enough anymore. Nothing was enough. "I can stop this," she whispered to herself, but even as she spoke, she knew the words weren't true. The force before her was beyond stopping. It was older than her hunger, older than the fractured world. It was the void itself, a force that existed beyond time, beyond creation and destruction. "You are nothing," the presence whispered, or felt, rather. "You are a mistake, a child of the abyss and humanity. You will not survive me." The words shattered the space around Lana, reverberating in a soundless scream that twisted her mind. She was no longer just the end of existence, no longer merely the fusion of hunger and human will. She was something worse, something more broken, caught in a war for reality itself. She could feel the walls of her mind splintering under the strain, and for the first time since her transformation, she feared. But even in her fractured state, something else stirred within her. A fragment of human will, a spark of defiance. She remembered the people, The faces she had once known, the lives she had consumed, the choices she had made. They hadn't been meaningless. She hadn't taken them just to feed. There had to be something more, something left. "I am not your pawn," she breathed, the words coming out broken but defiant. "I will fight. I will be something." And just as the darkness pressed against her, just as the last remnants of the abyss sought to swallow her whole, the very universe around them, what little remained of it, seemed to respond. The fragmented stars pulsed as if they felt the struggle, as if they were remembering their former selves, when they had been full of life and light. A wave of energy burst from Lana's form, fueled by the last vestiges of her humanity. She didn't know what she was doing, but she fought not just against the darkness, but against the emptiness of the void, against the loss of everything. The world didn't respond with the grandeur of a cosmic battle. No, there was no explosion. There was only shifting, a gradual change in the shape of existence itself. But Lana felt it. The void shuddered, as though it had been touched by something more human, more fragile, and for a moment, it faltered. And in that fleeting instant, the darkness hesitated. The void rippled violently around Lana, twisting like a storm as the true abyss pressed against her fragile form. The struggle was not just physical. It was an assault on her very essence, an attack on the remnants of the human consciousness she had been, something that had long been consumed by the hunger for the void. And yet, as the ancient force pushed forward, Lana could feel a flicker, a pulse within her, a heartbeat that didn't belong to the abyss. It was humanity, a spark of life that had somehow endured. Lana reached into the depths of her fragmented mind, struggling to find something, anything, to counter the consuming darkness. She had become something other, something beyond humanity and the abyss, but that part of her still existed. It hadn't been wiped away completely. The darkness had torn at her, broken her, but it had not erased her will to fight. "You are nothing," the true abyss whispered again. Its voice was not one of sound, but of force, a pressure so immense that it felt as though the very fabric of her being was being crushed from all sides. "You are a mistake, an accident, a flicker in the void. Your world is already mine. Your existence is already mine. There is no escape." Lana's form wavered, her body flickering between solid and formless as she tried to hold herself together. She could feel the universe buckling beneath the weight of the abyss. The stars trembled, their light dimming further with each passing moment, like candles in the wind. The remnants of the broken world, what little was left of it, began to disintegrate, falling into the void like dust. Reality was being rewritten, torn apart piece by piece. But as she reached for the last pieces of humanity within her, those fragments that had once been her, she realized something. The struggle against the true abyss wasn't one of force. It wasn't a war of power. It was a war of purpose. "You are wrong," she whispered, her voice breaking through the dark storm that raged within her. "You may consume, you may destroy, but you cannot erase the will to exist. I still choose to be." The true abyss recoiled, its pressure easing for a moment as though confused by the defiance in her words. Lana's consciousness, shattered and fragmented as it was, reached out to the fragments of reality around her. The remnants of stars, the broken pieces of planets, the last traces of what had once been, these were the things she clung to. The fragments of humanity were not gone, not entirely. They had chosen to stay behind, to exist as pieces of her, to give her the strength to choose. And in that moment of clarity, something inside Lana shifted. She no longer felt the pressure of the abyss as something alien. Instead, she embraced it, became it, but not fully. She wove herself into it, a part of the fabric of the void, but not its slave. She was something new, something in between, the last vestiges of humanity fused with the raw power of the darkness. It was like a resonance, a hum deep in the core of her being, as if the world, what was left of it, had finally recognized her will to exist. The true abyss, ancient and powerful, could not understand what was happening. It was used to consuming. It was used to obliterating. but it had never encountered this before. This force of will, this defiance. "What are you doing?" the abyss seethed. "You cannot defy me. You cannot rewrite the end." But Lana was no longer just a part of the void. She was the catalyst that could make the void shift. "I am not the end," she said, her voice no longer a fractured echo. "I am not the beginning either. I am the space between, the fracture, and this world still has room for something more." In the instant that followed, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Lana's form became a singularity, a point of creation and destruction wrapped in one. The remnants of her humanity and the abyss twisted together, forming something new, something terrifying. It was no longer a simple collision of opposing forces. It was a synthesis, a new kind of being, a being that could rewrite the rules of existence itself. The true abyss pushed forward again, trying to overwhelm her, to crush the will that had dared to resist. But this time, Lana did not fight with power. She fought with understanding. "You are not the only force in existence," she said, and the very fabric of the universe trembled. "You are not the only hunger." The true abyss hesitated once more, and in that moment of uncertainty, Lana changed the rules. With a wave of her fractured hand, or perhaps with a thought, for she no longer knew where the form ended and the void began, she split the darkness. She reached into the very heart of the abyss and pulled it apart, breaking the singularity of destruction into pieces, scattering the darkness like broken glass. The remnants of stars, those that had survived, flared back into life, their light blazing against the backdrop of the fractured world. The universe seemed to exhale, its breath cold and broken, but alive. For a brief moment, the true abyss was distant, its overwhelming presence retreating, as though it had been pushed back into the corners of the void where it belonged. It was not destroyed, but contained, locked away by the force of Lana's defiance. And yet, Lana knew this victory was not permanent. The abyss was an eternal force. It would return. But for now, the balance had shifted. The universe, what was left of it, was breathing again. "This is not over," the true abyss hissed, its voice like the shriek of 1,000 tortured souls. "You cannot contain me forever. I will return, and when I do, there will be no escape." Lana did not reply. She did not need to. She had won this round, but the true test was still ahead. The universe was not whole, not by any means, and she had yet to fully grasp what she had become. There were still fragments of reality to restore, still pieces of humanity to reclaim. For now, though, she stood in the center of the void, not as a destroyer, but as something more complex. The universe still spun around her, broken but not finished. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, she felt a strange sense of purpose. Not just a hunger to consume, not just a will to survive, but a desire to create. The void had been pushed back, but the real struggle had only just begun. The universe, in all its broken glory, stretched out before Lana, pulsing and flickering like a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a different world, a different moment. The stars, once dim and uncertain, had reignited in flashes of light. Some were weak, barely holding on to their existence, while others burned brighter than ever before. But none of them were whole. The reality she now faced was fractured, as if time itself had been splintered into countless shards, each moving on its own erratic path. Lana floated in the center of it all, a singularity of conflicting forces, humanity and the abyss. It was no longer a question of survival, nor of domination. The true abyss had retreated, but it was only a temporary reprieve. It was not gone, not destroyed. It was simply waiting, and Lana could feel its presence lurking at the edge of her awareness, like a predator circling its prey. But she was no longer the same. She had tasted the abyss, understood its hunger, and confronted it. And now, she knew it was not just destruction that defined the void. It was a hunger for creation, a hunger to rewrite. The abyss wasn't merely the end of things. It was the beginning too, a force that fed on worlds, yes, but also shaped them. Lana could feel that pull within her, tugging at the edges of her thoughts. The desire to create, to shape reality anew. The remnants of humanity still lingered within her, a fragmented, whispering presence. They were not entirely gone. She could hear their voices, faint but persistent, urging her to remember, to be what she once was, what they once were. They spoke of hope, of rebirth. They spoke of an existence beyond this twisted void. But that hope was complicated. The truth of her transformation weighed on her. She was no longer just Lana. She was something more, something bound to both the universe's destruction and its potential rebirth. "You cannot erase us," a voice whispered from the depths of her mind. "You must remember. You must return us to the world we lost." Lana closed her eyes, or, rather, the remnants of what was once her vision fluttered in an attempt to focus. The fragmented worlds around her began to swirl, their edges blurring into one another. She reached out, trying to gather them, to make sense of what had been broken. But as she reached for the stars, the pieces of the universe shifted, slipping through her grasp like sand. The void twisted in response. It was not just the abyss. It was a force that responded to her, like a living thing, seeking to reassert its control. The darkness, once reined in, surged forward, trying to pull her back into the nothingness. She felt the hunger rising again, an overwhelming desire to collapse everything into the void, to return all of it to its natural state. But she resisted. "I won't let it go," Lana murmured, her voice cracking through the emptiness. "I won't let everything die. Not again." The universe around her seemed to hear her words, responding with a tremor that spread through the broken fragments. The once dim stars now shone with new energy, their light reaching out across the abyss. But as their light grew, so did the hunger. The true abyss, though momentarily silent, had not retreated entirely. It whispered to her, pulling at her core. "You think you can rebuild?" The voice was no longer a distant hum. It was close, so close. "You are nothing but a fleeting echo. You cannot create what you were never meant to. The universe will break again. It always does." Lana shuddered. The abyss was right, at least in part. She was not the creator of this universe. She had never been meant to shape the world. She had only been its consumer. She had been the force of destruction, the inevitable end. But there was still something inside her, a spark of something more than just hunger. Hope, maybe, or something more complicated than that. A deep, ancient yearning. The fragments of reality pulsed around her, shifting erratically. Some fragments were still intact, holding onto the light of a distant memory, planets that once had life, stars that once had meaning. But other pieces were warped, twisted beyond recognition. She could feel them, these broken shards, reaching out toward her, crying for restoration. The pieces of humanity within her tugged again. "Do it," they whispered. "Save what is left. The world can be made whole again. You can find the path forward." But even as the voices urged her on, Lana could feel the pull of the abyss becoming stronger. It knew what she was now. She had touched its darkness. She had seen what it could offer, the complete erasure of all things, the perfect return to nothing. It was tempting, seductive, to end it all, to make everything vanish, to surrender to the hunger. But Lana fought it. "No," she whispered, her voice defiant. "I will create. I will not let this world collapse into itself. There is more than destruction. There is rebirth." With the last remnants of her strength, she reached out, pulling the fragments of reality toward her, binding them together. She could feel the raw power of the abyss pushing back, trying to unravel her work, but she held firm. The stars pulsed brighter, their light flaring as she shaped them. Worlds began to take form, imperfect but real. And yet, as Lana pressed forward, she could feel the true abyss stirring again. It was only a matter of time before it would attempt to consume her once more. But for now, she had made a choice. She would not yield to the void. She would not surrender. There was still life in this shattered world, and she would fight to protect it, even if the cost was her own existence. Lana's hands, if they could still be called that, were trembling. The fractured pieces of the universe hovered around her like shattered glass, each one pulsing with potential, each one glowing with the fragile light she had coaxed into being. The stars, planets, and fragments of reality were held together by a thin thread, suspended in a moment of precarious balance. The abyss, though momentarily stilled, was still there, a weight pressing on the edges of her mind. It whispered, beckoned, threatened. It would not let her go. Not so easily. She could feel it, a consuming force, reaching into the cracks of her creation, trying to unravel the very thread she had woven. The hunger that had once been her own desire to annihilate, to collapse everything back into the void, had taken root inside the fragments of her new world. It was a slow, insidious thing, spreading like a disease. The universe she had shaped, though it was still alive, was not whole. It could not be. Not yet. Lana took a deep breath, or something like it. It was hard to say if she even still breathed. She had become something other, something intertwined with both the remnants of humanity and the abyss itself. She was a paradox, a creature of creation and destruction bound together by a force greater than her understanding. "It's not enough," she whispered to herself, the words like a prayer. "I need more. The fragments aren't enough. I need something to hold it all together, something to anchor this new world." The stars shuddered, as if in response to her words. The fragments of the broken world shifted uneasily. She had drawn them together, but they were unstable. The darkness of the abyss still lurked in the corners of every fragment, seeking to swallow everything. She needed to stabilize them. She needed to complete the world. But the price of creation was heavy. Every time she reached for a new piece of reality, every time she tried to pull a star into alignment or restore a planet to its former state, the abyss pushed back, its hunger insatiable. The more Lana created, the more the void pressed against her, feeding off her energy, feeding off the fragments of her that remained. "You think you can escape me?" The abyss hissed, its voice crawling into her mind, thick and suffocating. "You think your little creation will stop the inevitable? You are mine, and this world." It paused, its voice becoming darker, colder. This world was never meant to be. Lana clenched her hands, feeling the pressure of the abyss squeezing her very existence. The universe around her flickered, and she had to steady herself. The weight of creation was becoming unbearable. With every piece of reality she molded, she could feel herself weakening. Her form was flickering, unstable. She could feel the fragments of humanity inside her, calling to her. They urged her to hold on, to remember who she was. But Lana was changing. The more she shaped the universe, the more she embraced the abyss that flowed within her. It was no longer just a force outside her. It was becoming a part of her, a force that was both within and without. She could feel its power, its pull. It was seductive. It was destructive, but it was also the only thing that offered certainty. "No," Lana muttered, her voice breaking. "I won't let you win." The creation of this new world, the slow rebuilding of what had been destroyed, was all she could focus on now. The pain of her transformation, the loss of her humanity, the relentless whispers of the abyss, was secondary. She had to keep going. She had to bring the universe back. But as she pushed forward, she realized something terrifying. In her desperation, in her drive to rebuild, she was changing the very nature of reality. Each piece she restored, each fragment she drew back into alignment, was not just a return to what had been. It was something new. The rules of the universe were bending, twisting, responding to her will. The reality she was creating was different, and that difference came at a cost. The more she shaped, the more she felt the pull of the abyss inside her. She could feel the hunger inside her, growing stronger. She had woven the universe together, but she had also tainted it. The fragments of humanity inside her were becoming dimmer, their voices quieter. The more she created, the more she became the void. It was not enough. She was not enough. "What have you done?" The voice of the abyss coiled around her mind, cold and mocking. "You cannot escape yourself. You cannot escape the truth. You have become nothing more than a tool, a puppet of the void. Everything you build will fall. The world around her shifted again, the fragile threads of creation trembling in the weight of her actions. The stars faltered, flickering like dying embers. The planets she had resurrected warped, their forms distorting as the abyss tugged at their edges. Lana felt her strength fading. She was losing herself, losing control. Her form flickered, becoming more and more unstable. The abyss was pulling her back in, inch by inch, dragging her toward the darkness where she had once been consumed. But even as the void threatened to swallow her once more, something else shifted within her. A faint, fragile flicker of resistance, humanity, perhaps. It was so small, so fleeting, that it seemed like nothing. But it was there. "I can still fight," Lana whispered, though her voice was barely audible. "I can still hold on." The weight of creation was unbearable. Her body, if it could still be called that, was crumbling under the strain. But she fought. With every ounce of her being, she reached out and tried to hold the world together. She tried to keep the stars burning, to keep the fragments of the universe from falling into nothingness. The abyss had tried to consume her, to erase her, to twist her into its image. But Lana, the last spark of humanity, the last flicker of defiance, refused to fade into nothing. She would rebuild, even if it cost her everything. The void roared in her ears. It was no longer a whisper, no longer a lingering presence in the back of her mind. The abyss had become the only voice, the only thing that mattered. It was the beating heart of the universe, a consuming, unyielding force. Every piece of reality she had touched, the stars, the planets, the very fabric of the world she had rebuilt, was collapsing under its weight. And Lana, in her desperation to create, had allowed this to happen. She was no longer sure of where she ended and the abyss began. Her form flickered, its shape crumbling like the universe she had tried so desperately to restore. The stars, bright, then dim, then gone, swirled around her in chaotic patterns. Some grew brighter, flaring with new energy, while others bled out into nothingness, consumed by the void that clung to her like a disease. Her vision blurred, each star and fragment of reality becoming distorted, unfamiliar. She could still feel the presence of humanity within her, faint but persistent, a whisper of a life she had once known. Their voices called to her, urging her to remember what she had been, what she had fought for. But it was difficult to hear them now. Their whispers were muffled, drowned out by the oppressive force of the abyss. "You cannot escape me," the voice of the abyss growled, its presence so close it was as if it were no longer outside her, but part of her. "You are mine. You always have been. There is no creation without destruction. You will never be whole again." Lana's heart, if she still had won, thudded painfully in her chest. She had felt it, the moment when the balance between creation and destruction had tipped. She had wanted to rebuild the universe, to defy the void and bring something new into being. But every step she had taken had brought her closer to the abyss. The fragments she had so carefully reconstructed had become unstable, fracturing once more under the pressure of the void's hunger. They pulsed erratically, shifting between existence and nothingness, torn apart by the tension of competing forces. The light of the stars, once steady and brilliant, flickered weakly, as though even they knew their fate was sealed. They burned, then faded, then burned again. Lana's hands, if they could be called hands, reached out to hold the universe together. She could feel the raw energy of creation beneath her fingertips, the potential of every star, every world, every possibility. But it was slipping away, like water through her fingers. The universe was becoming more and more alien, its reality distorted by her interference. Her form flickered again, and she felt something dark and familiar gnawing at her essence. She was slipping. The abyss was pulling her in. It was taking her. "You cannot hold on to what was never meant to be." The abyss taunted, its voice mocking, triumphant. "You are a flaw in the fabric of reality, and now you will return to me." You cannot escape. The hunger was too great. The pressure was too much. She was becoming something else. The remnants of humanity inside her, once a source of strength, now seemed weak, fading into the dark expanse of the universe. Their voices were becoming incoherent, scattered echoes in the vastness of the void. But Lana resisted. She fought. She had to. With every ounce of her being, she reached for the fragments, trying to pull them back together. She would not let them break. She would not let the universe return to the abyss. But as she did, something began to shift within her. Something deep and terrible. The more she tried to hold on to the universe, the more she felt it changing her. The abyss had never been an external force. It was not something she could simply defy or push away. It was within her, the very core of her being. And the truth was becoming undeniable. She was the abyss. Her body, if it could still be called that, began to distort, merging with the fragments around her. The stars burned brightly, then died in an instant, only to be reborn again, like fire flickering in a storm. The planets she had resurrected were twisting into impossible shapes, becoming something new, something unrecognizable. Lana's form was not immune to the change. She could feel herself becoming a part of the world she was shaping, becoming more alien with every passing moment. The abyss flowed through her, through the very marrow of her being. She could feel the hunger, the destruction, but also the creation, the raw energy of rebirth. The universe was rewriting itself under her hands. And yet, it was no longer her hands that held it together. It was the void. She could no longer distinguish between the creation and the destruction. They had become inseparable. And as she held on, as she fought to keep the world from collapsing entirely, she realized something terrifying. The universe was not being rebuilt. It was being reborn, but not in the way she had imagined. The laws that had once governed it, the order that had held everything together, were dissolving. What was left was a chaotic, unstable reality, one that could not sustain itself. The world she had created would not last. "No," she whispered, though her voice was weak, strained. "This can't be how it ends." But it already had. The universe she had shaped was not her own. She had not built it. She had broken it. She had tried to rebuild something that was never meant to be. And now, the abyss was not just a consuming force. It was her. It was the world. She had become part of the void itself. "You are me," the abyss whispered in her ear, its voice no longer separate from her own thoughts. "We are one. There is no creation. There is no destruction. There is only what I am, only what we are." Lana's vision blurred. The fragments of the universe, shattered, warped, dying, flickered before her eyes. And as the abyss drew her closer, as the last remnants of humanity slipped away from her, she realized that this was not the end. This was just the beginning. Lana's body, or what was left of it, shuddered as the last remnants of humanity flickered inside her. The stars that had once shimmered in the endless expanse of the universe now seemed like distant, hollow eyes, watching her with cold indifference. The planets, once vibrant and full of life, had become warped, their surfaces cracked, swirling with patterns that made no sense. The universe had become chaos, a fractured and distorted reflection of itself. And Lana was its architect, but no longer its creator. Her fingers twitched, but there was no strength in them. The energy that had once flowed through her was now tainted, her every movement weighed down by the abyss that clawed at her from within. Her form flickered, her edges fading in and out of visibility. The very substance of her being was bending and warping, twisted by the force she had tried to resist, the force that had always been part of her. She could still feel the hunger of the void, the endless gnawing at her soul, the insatiable desire to consume. The abyss was no longer a separate entity. It was a part of her now. The longer she fought, the more she became one with it. "You cannot outrun yourself," the abyss whispered through the jagged fragments of her thoughts, its voice a part of her own now. "You are what you fear, what you are running from." This world you've created is already dying. You can feel it, can't you? The universe trembled in response, as if it too understood what was happening. The stars flickered, their light dimming, their shapes growing more indistinct. The planets she had once restored began to twist and distort, as though reality itself could no longer maintain the illusion of stability. The very fabric of existence felt fragile, as if the entire universe was being held together by a thread too thin to withstand the weight of her actions. "You were never meant to rebuild," the abyss murmured, its voice seeping deeper into her mind. "You were meant to end it. Your existence was always an aberration. You've seen it, haven't you? The universe cannot be fixed. It must be consumed, destroyed. And you are the final piece of the puzzle, the key to it all." Her breath, if it could be called breath, pitched as the realization settled within her. It wasn't the universe that was dying. It was her. The fragments of the world she had tried to restore, the stars, the planets, the broken edges of existence, were mirroring her. She was disintegrating, her body, her mind, her very essence crumbling as the abyss consumed her from within. She reached out, desperately trying to maintain the semblance of order, but the universe was no longer hers to control. Every attempt to fix the world only twisted it further. The very laws of existence were bending, warping, and in her attempts to fight back, she had made things worse. What had once been a fragmented universe, desperately holding on to the remnants of what had been, was now slipping into an even greater chaos. The stars dimmed further, some of them collapsing inward, while others exploded in a violent burst of light before fading into nothingness. It was as if the universe itself was rejecting her. The more she tried to hold on to the shattered pieces of creation, the more they slipped away, as though they had never been whole to begin with. The abyss, her abyss, was winning. It was not just consuming the universe, it was consuming her. But there was a part of her, somewhere deep within, that still fought. There was a flicker of resistance, faint and almost forgotten, urging her to find a way to break free. "Fight it," the small, distant part of her whispered. "You can still choose." But the voice was barely a whisper, drowned out by the deafening roar of the void. There was nothing left for her to hold on to. The world she had tried to create was already gone, and she was fading with it. The last spark of humanity, the last shred of who she had been, was slipping away, consumed by the vast, infinite darkness that had always been there. And then, just as the last remnants of her form were about to collapse completely, she saw something in the distance. A star. It wasn't a star that belonged to the universe she had tried to rebuild. It was something new. It was different. The star shone brightly, but there was something wrong with it. It pulsed irregularly, its light flickering like a dying flame. But it was a light, a small, fragile light, and for a brief moment, Lana felt herself drawn to it. It was a light that seemed to call to her, offering her something that she had long since lost. Hope. But hope had no place here, not in the universe she had shaped. The abyss could not allow it. "You cannot leave," the abyss whispered. "This is the end. There is no escape for you." Lana's form flickered violently, her body threatening to disintegrate into nothingness. She could feel the abyss closing in on her, suffocating her. But the star, its light pulsing softly, was there. A glimmer of something, a spark. The light of the star seemed to pull at her, offering her something different. She reached out, stretching toward it, but her fingers, her hands, were already fading, dissolving into nothing. "You are nothing," the abyss taunted. "There is only me, only the void." The star's light seemed to flicker again, brighter this time. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lana felt something shift within her.
The light, it seemed, was not just the light of a dying star. It was something more, a piece of creation that had never been part of her, something separate from the abyss. It was a force outside of herself, a choice. Lana reached for it, not with her hands, but with the last remnants of her mind, her spirit. The light pulled at her, drawing her closer. And as she reached for it, she felt the abyss fight back, its darkness closing in around her, trying to swallow her whole. But she chose. She chose to resist. With a final, desperate cry, Lana allowed the light to engulf her. And then, everything went wide. Lana's existence fractured. The abyss had been all-encompassing, a hollow void that pulled at her from the inside out, devouring everything it touched. Her essence, what little of it remained, had been lost to the dark expanse. She had been nothing, reduced to a flicker of thought, a residue of her former self. But now, as the light of the distant star enveloped her, she felt a shift, a transition, like the breaking of a barrier between worlds. It was a pain she could not describe, not in the way her human mind once understood it. There was no physical sensation, no burning or tearing. But there was pressure, an overwhelming weight that squeezed the very core of her being. The light did not heal her, it changed her. She felt herself remake, not the whole of who she was, but a sliver, a part of her that resisted the abyss. The light was like a living thing, a soft yet vibrant pulse that beat against the infinite dark. It was an alien presence, not like the void she had known. The void had consumed, twisted, and devoured. But this light, this other force, felt different. It did not burn. It did not erase. It illuminated. But what was the cost? As the light held her, Lana could sense the ebb and flow of energy, her energy, merging with something vast and unknowable. The darkness, the abyss, did not simply disappear. It was still there, lingering at the edges of her consciousness, feeding off the remnants of the universe she had tried to remake. She had chosen to resist the pull of that darkness, but the abyss was patient. It did not relinquish its hold so easily. "You think you've escaped," the voice of the abyss whispered, cold and distant, as if it still had a presence within her. "But you cannot undo what you've done. You cannot simply walk away from me. You are mine, Lana. You always will be." Lana's mind reeled as she tried to focus on the pulse of the light. The voice of the abyss, a dark thread weaving through her thoughts, was relentless. It clawed at her consciousness, filling her with doubt, with despair. But as she fought to hold onto the light, a sense of clarity pierced the darkness. There was something there, something that the abyss could never take from her. Hope. It was a fragile thing, like the faintest glimmer of a star seen through the haze of night. But it was there, and it was enough. With a cry, Lana pushed against the weight of the abyss, focusing on that sliver of light. She could feel her form becoming more defined, less fragmented. The light poured into her like liquid fire, but it did not burn. It healed, slowly, painfully, but it healed nonetheless. It filled the emptiness the abyss had left inside her. The universe around her flickered, like a broken mirror reflecting a world she had once known. She saw glimpses of it, of the world she had tried to rebuild, of the stars she had sought to restore. They were not whole, not the same as they had once been. They were fractured, like shards of a shattered reality. But the fractures were not the end. They were the beginning. Lana felt her breath, her real breath, return. It was shallow at first, as if she had forgotten how to breathe. But with every inhalation, the light pulsed brighter, filling her with a warmth she had long since forgotten. As her body began to reform, she realized something else. The light was not creating a new universe. It was rebuilding the one she had broken, but in a way that was different from what she had originally imagined. It was as though the light was bringing balance, not order, to the chaotic fragments she had left behind. The world she had tried to restore now shimmered in the distance, hovering on the edge of existence, waiting to be realized. They were not fixed, not yet. But the cracks in them, the distortions she had introduced, were being welded together by the pulse of the light, stitch by delicate stitch. And yet, even as the light seemed to fill the void, Lana knew that it wasn't complete. The abyss still lingered, waiting for its moment. The universe, in its newly fractured form, had not reached a state of peace. It was teetering on the edge of destruction, held together by the thinnest thread of balance. The abyss had been part of her, and though she could resist it, she could not erase it. It was inside her. She had seen it. She had felt it, and it would not let her go. You cannot escape your own nature, the abyss whispered again, its voice now calm and almost soothing. You are a creature of both creation and destruction. You will always be torn between them. This light, it is not salvation. It is merely a pause. A brief respite. You will never escape me. Lana shuddered. But she did not look back. She would not let herself fall into that abyss again. Not now. But what was she becoming? Her thoughts swirled in the aftershock of the transformation, as she tried to make sense of the impossible situation she found herself in. The universe she had shattered, and in part rebuilt, was still fragile, still in flux. She could sense that it was not her actions alone that would determine its fate. The pulse of the light was not the sole force in this world. There were others, forces that Lana had never understood, perhaps never could. The moment she began to wonder about those forces, the light around her shifted. It bent, swirled, as though responding to her thoughts. The world she had attempted to heal flickered with new possibilities, 1,000 roads unfolding before her. You can still choose, the voice of the abyss whispered one last time. But remember, the choice is always yours. To create, or to destroy. Both will pull at you. Forever. Lana closed her eyes, the universe swirling around her. The choice lay before her, creation or destruction, the light of the start pulsating like a heart in the dark. And for the first time in a long time, Lana realized that she was no longer bound by the past. The future, fractured though it was, could still be her own. The question was no longer whether she could escape the abyss. It was whether she could choose to build a world that would never collapse again. Lana's hands trembled as she floated in the shifting void, the pulse of the light still vibrating through her, steady and rhythmic. It was a strange sensation, this mix of power and restraint, of creation and destruction. She felt whole in a way that she hadn't for what seemed like eons, but it was not the same as before. She wasn't the Lana who had once sought to restore the universe, nor was she the woman who had come to terms with her role as its destroyer. She was something other. The fractures in reality were still there, still visible, as they shimmered in and out of focus, as though the universe itself were breathing. But with each pulse of the light, they began to stitch themselves together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't whole. But it was becoming something new. Something alive. Lana closed her eyes for a moment, focusing inward, letting the pulse of the light guide her thoughts. She could feel the remnants of the abyss still circling within her. The black void, like a deep river flowing beneath the glassy surface, was always there. She could not forget it. But as much as it tried to tug at her, as much as it whispered promises of destruction and emptiness, she could sense a shift in herself. She was no longer just the abyss. She was the balance. That realization struck her with the weight of 1,000 worlds. She had tried to fix the universe before, only to break it further. She had tried to defy the abyss, only to become its vessel. But now, in this new state, she had a choice. The pulse of the light, the power that flowed through her, was not just a tool, it was part of her, a reflection of the delicate equilibrium that now lay within her grasp. The light did not erase the abyss, it balanced it. There were two sides of the same coin, the duality of creation and destruction intertwined. The question was not whether she could overcome the abyss, but whether she could reconcile with it. Could she continue to exist, creating and destroying in tandem, without letting either force consume her completely? And what would the universe become if she did? Lana opened her eyes again, staring into the shifting remnants of the world. The star that had saved her, if that was what it had done, now pulsed like a heartbeat, casting a soft glow that illuminated the chaos around her. The universe was still broken, its pieces floating in a disordered dance, as though trying to find their place once more. It was fragile, yet somehow more alive than it had ever been. "You think you can control this?" the abyss whispered in her mind, its voice as soft as, like silk dragging across stone. "But you cannot. You are a slave to it, just as you were before. No matter how you try to rebuild, you will always be tied to me. The universe is mine, and so are you. Lana clenched her fists, feeling the warmth of the light flooding her body, pushing back against the familiar cold pull of the abyss. She had felt its lure too many times to ignore it. It had been a part of her since the beginning, and it would always call to her. But for the first time, she felt no fear of it. She didn't need to fight the abyss. She just needed to learn how to live with it. Balance, she thought again. It was not a solution that could be achieved in a single moment. It was a constant act, a way of being. As she floated among the remnants of creation, Lana could sense that something had begun to change in the universe. The planets, the stars, the forgotten fragments of worlds, all of it was now connected, linked by the pulse of the light that flowed through her. The power she wielded, the responsibility she bore, was immense. She could feel the weight of every choice, every action. And yet, in the silence between the stars, there was something else, a question. A murmur that reached her from the farthest reaches of the universe. She focused on it, her mind stretching outward, and for the first time since she had encountered the abyss, she felt the presence of something beyond herself. It was not a voice like the abyss, nor was it a force of destruction. It was alive, but not like anything she had ever encountered. The pulse of the light thrummed more intensely as Lana let herself connect to the presence, drawing her thoughts closer. "What are you?" the voice asked, and Lana felt it deep in her bones, like an ancient whisper. Lana didn't know how to answer. She had no name for what she had become. The universe around her had shifted, and yet it felt as though she were standing on the edge of something much larger. Something beyond creation. "You are the thread," the voice continued. "You have touched the fabric of existence, woven yourself into it. But there are many threads in the tapestry, many forces that guide and shape the world. You must decide where you belong." The light pulsed again, louder now, and for the first time, Lana felt a sense of direction. The universe was not merely hers to rebuild. She was not its architect. She was a part of it, woven into its very being. And in that moment, she realized that the path ahead was not one of control, but of understanding. She was a thread in the grand tapestry of existence, connected to every other thread. And though she might still influence the world, she was no longer its master. Lana took a deep breath, feeling the universe breathe with her. Her presence was not a force that would shape things into her image. It was a part of something much greater, a system too complex for any single being to understand. But she had a role to play, and she would learn to live in it, to weave herself into the greater pattern. The pulse of the light quieted, and Lana could feel the presence withdraw, leaving her with an immense sense of peace. She understood now. Balance was not a destination. It was the journey itself. The stars above her began to steady, their light now vibrant and clear. The fractures in reality were still there, but they had been tempered. There was a harmony in the way the universe now pulsed, a rhythm that resonated with every particle of existence. The light, the abyss, creation, and destruction, they were all threads in the same weave. They could never be entirely separate. Lana looked down at her hands, now fully formed once more, no longer trembling with uncertainty. She felt centered, for the first time in her long existence. The abyss was still within her, a part of her, but it no longer controlled her. And the light, the force she had chosen, was no longer a tool, but a reflection of her own heart. She could feel the weight of the universe beneath her, fragile and beautiful. She would not remake it. She would not control it. But she would protect it. The universe had settled, at least for the moment. The vastness of space was no longer a fractured echo of forgotten worlds. It had come together like a puzzle piece, each section finding its place, albeit imperfectly. The stars shone brightly in the dark canvas, some whole, some barely formed, but they all pulsed with life. The galaxies, though distant, had found their rhythm. The silence between them no longer felt like an absence but a breath, a pause that stretched out over eons. Lana floated among it all, the light within her now a steady pulse, not overwhelming but constant. The abyss, though still present within her, was quieter now. No longer did it seek to consume her or force her into a choice of total destruction. It had become a part of the quiet rhythm of the universe, a necessary balance to the creation she had helped bring into being. She had thought, at first, that this peace would be her reward, a final respite after a long journey of destruction and rebuilding. But the universe was not static. It did not stay still, and neither would she. Something stirred. Lana felt it first as a subtle vibration at the edge of her senses. It wasn't the familiar, oppressive presence of the abyss. No. This was different. Something was shifting. And in the deep, distant places of the universe, she felt the pull of another force. It wasn't destruction, nor creation, but something else entirely. Something that could not simply be balanced. Her thoughts rushed back to the mysterious voice she had encountered. You were a thread, and she understood, in that moment, that she was not the only thread in the universe. There were others, threads that were pulling in different directions, threads that had been woven long before her existence. And now, some of them were beginning to unravel. She knew, deep in her bones, that her time of passive observation was over. The balance she had helped create was fragile, a delicate thread that could be severed by forces much larger than herself. And though she had learned to live within it, she now realized that her role was not simply to exist in the balance, but to guard it. The light within her flared, and for the first time since her transformation, Lana felt the deep well of her power surge, but not in a way she recognized. This was no longer about simply creating or destroying, this was about protection. She understood the threads of existence now, as she had never before, and she saw how easily they could be torn apart. The universe was a fragile thing, and it had been saved from ruin, but it had not yet stabilized. There were forces at play, ancient and powerful, that desired to rewrite the pattern of existence itself. The light within her could fight them, but only if she chose to fight. And even then, there would be a cost. She reached out with her mind, seeking the source of the disturbance. The stars above her dimmed for a moment, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. The disturbance grew stronger, closer. The fabric of space seemed to tremble, threads pulling, unraveling in slow motion, as though a great tension was building somewhere at the very edge of existence. Lana's heart beat faster, her body humming with a new purpose. She could feel the strain now. The world was pulling apart at the seams, and she, the one who had once tried to rebuild it, was the only one who could mend it. But she couldn't do it alone. For the first time, Lana reached outward, not just to the universe, but to the other threads of existence. The force that had whispered to her, that had called her a thread, now pulsed back. She could feel others who had woven their lives, their purpose, into the cosmic tapestry. And they were waiting. The cosmic threads converged on Lana, and she understood their message. She was not alone in this. The universe, vast and incomprehensible, was made of many forces, many beings, each connected in ways she could not fully grasp. But together, they held the pattern, and together, they would protect it. But the price for maintaining the balance was high. The disturbance she had felt was not a simple force. It was a convergence of all the threads of existence, each pulling in its own direction. Some wanted to create, others to destroy, and still others sought to tear the fabric of the universe apart, to unravel it completely. There were forces that Lana could not yet see, old and ancient beings whose influence stretched far beyond what she could control. It was no longer just a matter of existence. It was a matter of choice. Lana's hands clenched, feeling the threads of reality twisting in her grasp. She could fight back against this disturbance, using the light inside her to weave the threads back together, but she could also tear them apart, sever the forces pulling at the universe and start again. She had the power, the potential, to reshape everything. She could use the light within her to force the universe to bend to her will, to make it perfect. But that was the same temptation she had faced before. Lana closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting the light settle within her. She had rebuilt once before, but at what cost? Was the universe meant to be perfect, or was it meant to be lived in, with all its flaws, its impermanence, its beauty? The abyss, though quiet, stirred within her, a reminder of the destruction she had caused. But now, in this moment, Lana realized something deeper. Balance was not about control, nor was it about perfection. It was about acceptance. It was about understanding that creation and destruction, light and darkness, life and death, were all intertwined. There would always be threads that unraveled, and there would always be those that held them together. She had the power to sever the threads, to tear the universe apart. But she also had the power to let it be. In the end, Lana chose to protect the pattern. She reached out with the light inside her, not to control it, but to understand it. And as she did, the threads of reality snapped back into place, the universe repairing itself slowly, steadily. The disturbance subsided. The tension released. And for the first time, Lana felt a true sense of peace. The universe had settled, but it was not as it had once been. It was imperfect, fragile, but it was alive. And that was enough. Lana stood at the edge of existence, watching the stars shimmer in the dark sky. She felt the pull of the abyss within her, but it was no longer a threat. It was a part of her, as the light was. She had found the balance, the harmony between creation and destruction. Her journey had not been about controlling the universe, it had been about understanding it. And in that understanding, she had found peace. The threads of existence were not hers to control. They were hers to protect. And as the stars burned in the distance, Lana knew that her role in the tapestry of life had only just begun.